Get comfortable. Turn the lights down. We're going to spend the next several hours in Springfield, and once we start pulling at these threads, the town starts to look very different from the one you remember. The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989, 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. And in all that time, across every single one of those episodes, something has been quietly wrong with Springfield. Not as a joke, not as a cartoon convention, as a pattern, laid into the structure of the show itself, consistent across decades, pointing toward answers that the town's residents can never quite see. Tonight we're going to see them. Consider the geography first. Springfield has an ocean. It also has mountains. It has a desert nearby, and also a glacier. It has a gorge deep enough to injure people who fall into it, but shallow enough that characters regularly climb out. It has a tire fire that has been burning continuously for decades. It has a nuclear power plant visible from almost anywhere in town, and yet the town's skyline also contains references to New England architecture, Midwestern industrial design, and the kind of sprawling suburban grid that is particular to the American Southwest. Geographically, Springfield should not be possible. It contains landforms and climates that could not coexist within the borders of any single American state. The creators have been asked about this. The show's creator, Matt Groening, once told Smithsonian Magazine that he named the town Springfield because it was one of the most common city names in America, specifically because there is a Springfield in nearly every state. That was his answer. Universal ambiguity by design. Springfield is every town and no town simultaneously. And on its face, that's a satisfying explanation. The show was built to resonate with a broad audience, and anchoring it to a specific location would narrow that resonance. Making Springfield feel like it could be anywhere makes it feel like it could be your town. But sit with the geography for another moment, and something starts to feel less like clever design and more like evidence of something else entirely. The ocean and the mountains, the desert and the glacier, the harbor and the farmland. These features don't coexist by accident. In every episode where the geography matters, the terrain is exactly what the story needs it to be. When a plot requires a beach, Springfield has a beach. When a plot requires a ski mountain, that mountain is suddenly 40 minutes away. When a plot requires a canyon, the Springfield Gorge appears. The landscape reshapes itself to accommodate the story. And nobody in Springfield ever comments on the fact that their town's physical geography seems to be slightly different every time they drive out of it, which is either very clever, self-aware writing, or it's evidence that Springfield exists somewhere outside the normal rules of physical space. We'll come back to that later. Much later. For now, let's talk about the people. Springfield has a population that various episodes have put anywhere between 6,000 and 1,000,000, depending on who's counting and when. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that the population is, by any clinical standard of evaluation, not entirely well. The residents of Springfield have 4 fingers on each hand. Not as a stylistic shorthand borrowed from old animation traditions, though that's the industry explanation. Within the show's own logic, every person born and raised in Springfield has 4 fingers. Every person who comes in from outside, every celebrity guest, every visiting character from another city or country, has proportions and features more consistent with normal human anatomy. The people who live in Springfield look different from the people who don't. Then there's the skin. Everyone in Springfield is yellow. Not tan, not pale, not any variation of normal human skin tone. Yellow. A specific shade of saturated yellow that exists nowhere in the natural human color spectrum. And again, visitors to Springfield do not share this trait. The yellow skin belongs to Springfield. Homer Simpson, the show's central character, has an IQ that the show itself has stated is somewhere around 55. His skull has a shape that defies conventional human anatomy. His overbite is so pronounced it should interfere with his ability to eat. His eyes bulge from his head in a way that suggests either extraordinary ocular pressure or a fundamental difference in the structure of his orbital sockets. He absorbs physical trauma that would kill a normal person many times over. He has survived explosions, falls from significant heights, direct contact with high-voltage electricity, and at least 2 instances of what should have been fatal blunt force trauma. He heals from all of it, quickly, quietly, and without any lasting physical damage. Marge Simpson has maintained the same towering blue beehive hairstyle for 36 years without apparent effort. The hair grows upward, against gravity, in a rigid structure that requires no product or support. It simply exists, pointing toward the sky, defying physics with the casual confidence of something that has always been this way and sees no reason to change. Bart Simpson has hair that forms perfect geometric spikes without any styling product. Lisa Simpson has a star-shaped head. Maggie Simpson, at 1 year old, has been 1 year old for 3.5 decades. These are the normal people of Springfield. Now here is what makes the town feel stranger the longer you look at it. Springfield has a history, a specific, documented, occasionally contradictory history, but a history nonetheless. The town was founded by a man named Jebediah Springfield, whom later research within the show revealed to be a fraud, a criminal, and a murderer who stole another man's identity to escape consequences in the East. The founding myth of Springfield is built on a lie. The man the town named itself after was not who the town thought he was, and the residents discovered this. In the episode where Lisa uncovered the historical fraud, Springfield was faced with a choice between a comfortable founding mythology and an uncomfortable truth. Springfield chose the myth. The town decided, collectively, to continue celebrating Jebediah Springfield as a hero, knowing what he was, because the alternative, admitting that their civic identity was built on a fiction, was too destabilizing to accept. That choice, made in an early season, sets the template for everything that follows. Springfield is a town that knows how to look away. It has been practicing this skill for a long time, long enough that the skill has become instinct. Long enough that the residents no longer even notice they're doing it. They look at a three-eyed fish in the river and they shrug. They watch their employer block out the sun and they move on. They see a man who has apparently been alive since the 1880s, running their only major employer, and they never ask the obvious question. This isn't stupidity exactly, or not just stupidity. It's something more specific than that. It's a particular kind of collective inattention that functions like a social agreement. We will not see what we are not supposed to see. We will not ask what we are not supposed to ask. And anyone who breaks that agreement, anyone who insists on the uncomfortable thing, will be made to feel the full weight of the town's disapproval. Springfield is a place that has spent decades becoming very good at not knowing what it knows. And the theories we'll spend tonight exploring, every single one of them, are attempts to understand why. The radiation theory says the town is physically contaminated, and the contamination has affected the population's biology and cognition in ways that make critical thinking genuinely difficult. The coma theory says none of it is real, that Springfield exists inside the unconscious mind of a man who went under in April of 1993 and has not surfaced since. The denial theory says Springfield is simply a community that has made a choice, repeatedly and deliberately, to maintain a comfortable fiction over an uncomfortable reality, and that the show's episodic reset structure is evidence of this choice in action. The immortality theory asks how a man born in the 1880s is still running a nuclear power plant in the 2020s, and what that says about the relationship between extreme wealth and biological continuity. And threading through all of them is a question that the show has circled for 36 years without ever quite landing on directly. What is Springfield really? Not geographically, not demographically. Not in terms of its animation style, or its cultural footprint, or its place in television history. What is it in terms of its internal logic? What are the rules of this place? Why does time not pass here? Why do people not change? Why does catastrophe leave no scar? Why does the most dangerous industrial facility in the history of fiction sit at the center of a residential community and operate without consequence, decade after decade, while the people living in its shadow develop physical characteristics that do not appear in populations anywhere else? There are answers to these questions. Or at least, there are theories that approach answers closely enough that the distance between theory and answer starts to feel very small. Let's start at the beginning. With the thing that has been sitting in the center of Springfield since the very first episode, visible from almost every angle of the town, casting its shadow over every street and every house and every family that has ever tried to build a life in this impossible place. The power plant. But first, settle in a little more. Let the voice wash over you. Let Springfield come to you slowly, the way fog comes in off water, the way sleep comes when you stop fighting it. We've got a long night ahead of us. And Springfield has been waiting. Before we go any further, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is, and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, let's get into it. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. 2 reactor units, a pressurized water design, cooling towers visible for miles in every direction. The primary source of electrical power for the entire town, owned exclusively by Charles Montgomery Burns, and operated on a day-to-day basis by a safety inspector whose qualifications for the job are, at best, theoretical. The plant has been the backdrop of this show since its very first episode. It's where Homer works. It's where Homer has worked for his entire adult life. And it sits at the northern end of Springfield's skyline like a monument to something the town can't quite name, but has never been able to ignore. The nuclear mutation theory begins with a very simple observation. Everything in Springfield that should look normal doesn't. The fish in the river have 3 eyes. The residents have 4 fingers and yellow skin. The wildlife around the plant shows physical anomalies that don't appear in wildlife elsewhere. The people who live in Springfield exhibit biological characteristics that distinguish them visibly from people who come in from outside. And all of this, the fish, the skin, the fingers, the eyes, the remarkable healing capacity, the failure of normal cognitive function, all of it centers on the single most contaminating piece of industrial infrastructure in the show's universe: the plant. Let's establish what we actually know about the Springfield nuclear power plant, because the show has been remarkably forthcoming about its condition over the years. A surprise safety inspection, one of the show's most cited pieces of canonical evidence for this theory, found 342 safety violations. Not minor paperwork issues, actual structural, operational, biological, and environmental violations of the kind that would, in any realistic regulatory context, result in immediate shutdown and criminal investigation. The estimated cost to bring the facility into compliance with existing safety standards was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. He refused not because the money was unavailable. Burns is a billionaire many times over, and $56 million is a rounding error in his personal finances. He refused because fixing the problems would mean creating a paper trail that acknowledged those problems had existed in the first place. And acknowledging that the problems had existed would open the door to a question that Burns could not afford anyone asking. What had those problems already done to the people living nearby? The violations themselves are worth dwelling on for a moment, because the show lists them with a casualness that makes them easy to pass over. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into the town's water supply. Radioactive waste stored on the grounds of the elementary school's playground. Plutonium being used as a desk paperweight. Cooling towers patched with chewing gum. Rats in the facility described as luminous, glowing, emitting visible light from their bodies as a direct result of sustained radiation exposure. And then there's the one the show drops so quietly that most viewers don't register it as significant on first watch. Human skeletons in the basement. Human skeletons. In the basement of an operational nuclear power facility. The show shows them to you and then moves forward without comment. Without investigation, without any character pausing to note that there are dead people in the building where they work. The bones are there. They are acknowledged visually. And then the story continues. The safety inspector standing between all of this and the residential community surrounding it is Homer Simpson. The show's own creator has stated that Homer has an IQ of approximately 55. That puts him in a range associated with significant cognitive impairment. And in the episode where Homer discovers that a crayon has been lodged in his brain since childhood, that cognitive profile is given a physical explanation. A foreign object, a crayon, has been sitting in Homer's frontal lobe since he was a small boy, physically disrupting his ability to process complex information, maintain sustained logical reasoning, or recognize patterns that would be obvious to a person without that kind of obstruction. This is the man whose job it is to prevent nuclear catastrophe. He sleeps at his workstation. He has caused actual reactor incidents, including one where he threw a donut into the reactor core out of curiosity. He regularly ignores warning systems. He has, on multiple documented occasions, accidentally triggered shutdown protocols through sheer inattention. And he has been doing this job, this specific job, in this specific facility for the entirety of his adult life. Now, let's look at what the radiation theory actually proposes. The theory argues that the plant's systematic violations, the dumped waste, the leaking coolant, the absence of containment protocols, have been slowly contaminating Springfield's water supply, soil, and air for decades. That the visible physical characteristics shared by Springfield residents, the yellow skin, the four-digit hands, the unusual eye structure, the aberrant skull shapes, are the biological result of multi-generational exposure to low-level radiation. And that the cognitive effects, the remarkable incuriosity of the population, their extraordinary capacity for forgetting catastrophic events, their inability to connect obviously related pieces of information, are the neurological consequence of the same contamination. The theory doesn't require you to believe anything the show hasn't already shown you. It requires only that you take the show's own visual evidence seriously. Let's start with the fish. Blinky. Blinky the three-eyed fish appears in the second season of the show. He is pulled from a river near the power plant. His existence immediately becomes a political issue. A candidate for governor uses Blinky as evidence that Burns is poisoning Springfield's environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that it's harmless. The town watches. The candidate loses the election. Springfield shrugs and moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts a follow-up study on the river. Nobody asks the question that is screaming to be asked. If the fish have developed an extra eye from sustained exposure to whatever the plant is putting into that river, what is happening to the humans who are drinking the same water? The answer the radiation theory provides has been sitting in the background of the show for most of its run. The humans are affected too. They have been affected for decades. The difference between the fish and the residents is that the fish show a dramatic, visible mutation that's easy to point to, while the residents show a pattern of subtler, more distributed changes that are collectively easier to explain away. Four fingers can be attributed to animation style. Yellow skin can be framed as an aesthetic choice. Unusual skull shapes can be dismissed as the natural variation of cartoon characters. But the theory asks you to notice something that the casual viewer almost never does. When characters arrive in Springfield from outside, they look different. Celebrity guest characters, visiting relatives, authority figures from other cities, they have 5 fingers, normal skin tones, eyes that sit in their heads at angles more consistent with actual human anatomy. The show draws them with proportions that feel more grounded, more realistic. Not dramatically different, but observably different. And the gap is noticeable once you're looking for it. The mutation theory frames this visual distinction not as an inconsistency in the animation, but as information. Within the logic of the show's own universe, the people who live in Springfield look different from the people who don't. And the only environmental factor that could explain a population-wide physical difference of this kind is the contamination that the show has been documenting since its second season. Now let's take the theory further, because the physical mutations are actually the least interesting part of it. The neurological effects are where things get genuinely unsettling. The show has given us extensive documentation of Springfield's collective cognitive patterns, and those patterns are bizarre in a very specific way. Springfield residents don't just forget things. They forget things in a manner that is selective and systematic. They forget catastrophes. They forget revelations. They forget moments where the normal consequence of an event should be sustained community change, and they wake up the next episode as if nothing happened. The dome that sealed them in. The environmental catastrophes. The oil spill. The multiple times their civic institutions were revealed to be corrupt, incompetent, or outright criminal. The town processes these events and releases them completely. Clean slate, back to baseline, ready to be shocked by the next thing. A psychologist would describe this pattern as something more specific than ordinary forgetfulness. Ordinary forgetfulness is random. It erodes memories gradually over time without regard for their content. What Springfield demonstrates is something more targeted. The community forgets the things that would require them to take action if remembered. The inconvenient things. The dangerous things. The things that point toward causes and demand responses. That's not the pattern of normal forgetting. That's the pattern of a cognitive system that has been chemically compromised in a way that specifically affects critical evaluation and long-term behavioral integration, which is interestingly consistent with what we know about the neurological effects of certain kinds of radiation exposure. There is a scene in the show, one of the most famous in its entire run, where Homer's crayon is removed from his brain and his IQ rises dramatically. In the episode that follows, Homer is intelligent. Genuinely, clearly, observably intelligent. He can read complex texts quickly. He can follow logical chains of reasoning. He can synthesize information across domains. He writes a report on the dangers of the nuclear plant that is so comprehensive and so damning that it triggers a federal investigation, and then he has the crayon put back in. Homer chooses stupidity over intelligence because intelligence in Springfield was painful. When he could think clearly, he could see clearly. He could see his job for what it was. He could see the town for what it was. He could see the gap between the life he was living and the life he was capable of living, and that gap was unbearable. So he returned to the fog. He chose the fog. And the radiation theory would note that Homer's crayon is just the visible version of something that has been happening to every resident of Springfield for decades. Something invisible. Something odorless and colorless and undetectable without the kind of testing equipment that nobody in Springfield is motivated to deploy. Burns, of course, is the pivot point of the entire theory. The show has been remarkably transparent about Burns's relationship with radiation. He undergoes weekly medical treatments so intensive that they cause his body to emit a visible green glow in the dark. In the episode where Homer mistakes Burns for an alien in the woods near Springfield, the show eventually reveals that the glowing figure Homer saw was simply Burns, walking home from his weekly treatment session in a dazed and radiant state. The treatments keep him alive for exactly one more week. If he misses a session, he dies. His body cannot maintain its biological functions without regular, controlled exposure to radiation administered at clinical levels. Burns isn't just the owner of the plant. He is, in the most literal sense possible, radiation dependent. His continued existence is contingent on a substance that his facility leaks uncontrolled into the community surrounding it. He manages his radiation exposure with extraordinary precision and extraordinary resources. The residents of Springfield receive their radiation exposure from the leaking water and the contaminated air and the cracked cooling towers, and have no resources to manage anything. He is the experiment and they are the control group. Except nobody told the control group they were in an experiment. And the most damning piece of evidence for this dynamic is not the three-eyed fish or the yellow skin or the safety violations. The most damning piece of evidence is Homer's continued employment. When German investors briefly purchased the plant from Burns, the very first thing they did after the acquisition was fire Homer. Not eventually, immediately. They looked at his record, his competence, his qualifications, and they fired him before they had finished unpacking. Then they looked at the cost of bringing the facility into compliance, came very close to going bankrupt from the estimate alone, and sold the plant back to Burns. Burns reacquired the plant and rehired Homer the same day? Think about that sequence of events. Burns, who has access to every operational employee assessment the plant has ever generated, who has watched Homer fall asleep at his workstation and cause reactor incidents and lose nuclear material, made a deliberate choice to bring this specific man back to this specific job. Not out of fondness, not out of sentimentality. Burns is not a sentimental man, out of strategy. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down within weeks of reviewing its actual operational status. Homer ensures the violations continue. Homer's incompetence is not a flaw in Burns's plan. Homer's incompetence is the plan. The plant keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. The population stays cognitively impaired. And the man at the center of this system stays comfortably in his mansion, receiving his weekly radiation treatments, watching the town below him generate the electricity that funds his continued existence. Springfield is a closed loop, a contamination system that self-perpetuates through the very damage it causes. The people are too impaired to notice the contamination. The contamination ensures they stay too impaired to notice. And the man responsible for the contamination employs the man responsible for preventing it and pays him just enough to stay comfortable and just little enough that the alternative never feels viable. The yellow skin, the four fingers, the bulging eyes, the overbites and the unusual skull shapes, and the dogs with aberrant proportions, and the fish with 3 eyes, and the man in the woods who glows green in the dark. It's all the same story, told in biology. Told in the slow language of exposure and mutation and consequence, whispered across 36 years while the show smiled its bright yellow smile and pretended to be a comedy about a family with a funny dad. The power plant is not the backdrop. It was never the backdrop. It is the origin point of everything that Springfield is and everything that Springfield cannot stop being. Every corrupted cell, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset, every morning where the residents of this town wake up without memory of what happened yesterday, traces back to the same cracked towers, the same leaking pipes, the same invisible poison distributed evenly through the same water every household in Springfield drinks without question. The radiation theory explains the mutations. It explains the forgetting. It explains Homer's employment. It explains Burns's survival. It explains the physical difference between Springfield residents and visitors. It explains, in a single coherent framework, why this town looks the way it looks and behaves the way it behaves, and has never, in 36 years of close observation, figured out what is being done to it. But there's another theory that goes further than the radiation. A theory that doesn't just explain what Springfield is. A theory that explains why Springfield feels, in its later seasons, increasingly untethered from the logic of cause and effect, increasingly dreamlike, increasingly like a place where the normal rules of consequence have been suspended indefinitely. A theory that begins on a specific date in April of 1993, with a man lying unconscious in a hospital bed, and a show that may have been a dream ever since. Let the image of the plant settle in your mind as we move forward. The cooling towers against whatever sky Springfield happens to have today. The low hum of something operating without oversight. The water flowing from the facility into the river, and from the river through the pipes, and from the pipes into every glass and every cup and every pot of coffee, in every kitchen in a town that has never once stopped to wonder why the fish have 3 eyes. Close your eyes for a moment if you'd like. Let Springfield be quiet. We'll be here when you come back. The 1st of April 1993. That's the date. Hold it in your mind for a moment, because if one particular fan theory is correct, it is the most important date in the history of The Simpsons. The day the show changed, not in the way that shows change gradually over time, through the accumulation of creative decisions and staff turnover and the natural drift of any long-running series. The day the show changed all at once, at a specific moment, in a way that can be traced back to a single episode. The episode is called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. It aired as the 18th episode of Season 4. The premise is simple. Bart plays a series of April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one escalating from the last. The finale prank involves Bart taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. The shaker pressurizes the can far beyond its structural limits. When Homer opens it later, the explosion is violent enough to send him to the hospital. While Homer is in his hospital bed, he spots a vending machine across the room and moves toward it to get a candy bar. The vending machine tips over and pins him. Homer flatlines. He enters a clinically unconscious state that lasts 7 weeks. The show treats this as a plot device. At the end of the episode, Homer wakes up. Bart tearfully confesses his guilt at Homer's bedside. Homer springs awake, immediately begins strangling Bart. The family laughs, the credits roll. Everything is back to normal, except for one detail, delivered in the final moments of the episode almost as an afterthought. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. Permanently, the damage cannot be reversed. He is, as a direct result of this event, measurably less cognitively functional than he was before it happened. The show tells you this, and Homer responds by laughing for reasons he doesn't fully understand, and then the episode ends. The coma theory, first widely circulated by a Reddit user named Hard Topic a Name, begins with a question that the episode invites but never answers. What if Homer didn't wake up? What if the moment where Homer springs awake and strangles Bart is not a depiction of Homer regaining consciousness, but a depiction of what Homer's unconscious mind wished would happen? What if the show's presentation of Homer's recovery is itself part of the dream? What if everything that has aired since that April evening in 1993 is the internal experience of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, generating a detailed simulation of his life, fed by fragments of memory and ambient information from the room around him? The theory is called the Homer coma theory, and it is the single most debated, most widely discussed, and most internally consistent fan theory the show has ever produced. Let's look at what the evidence actually says. The first piece of evidence is tonal, and it's significant. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a specific kind of show. It was grounded in recognizable domestic reality. Homer attempting to quit drinking, Marge navigating a temptation toward infidelity, Bart struggling academically and facing the real possibility of repeating a grade. Lisa developing a crush on a substitute teacher and dealing with the peculiar heartbreak of that particular kind of adolescent feeling. The show's comedy came from the friction between the Simpson family's aspirations and the limitations of their actual lives. Financial anxiety, marital pressure, parenting failure, the mundane disasters of middle-class American existence. After the coma episode, the show becomes something else. Homer goes to space. Homer discovers his mother is a fugitive radical who has been hiding from federal authorities for decades. Homer joins a secret society. Homer becomes the leader of a neighborhood vigilante group. Homer befriends the Loch Ness Monster. Homer meets the President of the United States, multiple presidents, on multiple occasions. Homer travels to dozens of foreign countries. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs, many of them in a single season. The show goes from a domestic family sitcom grounded in economic anxiety and recognizable suburban failure to a show where the central character's life has the logic and the scale of a dream. Where each episode operates independently of the last, where the consequences of one story don't carry into the next, where the rules of physics and biology and social consequence bend and flex in ways that serve the needs of the narrative without any obligation to coherence. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons declined for the better part of 20 years. Fans argue about the precise episode where the quality dropped. Critics point to various creative decisions. Showrunners point to challenges specific to long-running production. But the coma theory offers a more specific answer. The show didn't decline. Homer's brain deteriorated. Every increasingly surreal storyline. Every plot that operates on dream logic rather than real-world logic. Every moment where the rules of Springfield seem to bend in ways that serve Homer's wish fulfillment rather than the natural consequences of events. These aren't creative failures. They're symptoms. They're the observable evidence of a brain that spent 7 weeks in shutdown and emerged with 5% less of its capacity, then continued losing function slowly, over the course of 36 years, as the dream it generates becomes progressively less tethered to the reality it was originally modeled on. But the most emotionally compelling piece of evidence for the coma theory isn't tonal, it's chronological. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, there is a scene that most viewers remember as a charming theological throwaway. Homer has stayed home from church and fallen asleep on the couch. In his half-sleep, he has a conversation with God. An actual, direct, personal conversation with God. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life. But not yet. His time is coming. Not yet, but soon. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline from God's prophecy to Homer's coma is precise. The language God uses is specific. His time is coming. And 6 months after that conversation, Homer's conscious life ended, and a dream began. If you accept the coma theory, then that conversation with God was not a throwaway gag. It was a warning. God was telling Homer that his waking life was drawing close to its end, that what came after would be something different, something that looked like life, but operated by different rules. And then it happened exactly as God said it would. Now, let's look at the age question, because it's the single most powerful piece of evidence the coma theory has to offer. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa is 8, Maggie is 1. Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s. The entire population of Springfield exists in a permanent present tense, frozen at the ages they occupied when the show began. Every other theory that attempts to explain this phenomenon requires an argument about cartoon convention or biological mutation or collective denial. The radiation theory says the mutations have disrupted normal cellular aging. The denial theory says the town has agreed to ignore the passage of time. The cartoon convention argument says this is simply how long-running animated shows work. The coma theory needs none of these explanations. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went unconscious in April 1993 and never came back out. Homer's children are 10 and 8 and 1 in his dream, because that is how old they were the last time he was conscious enough to accurately perceive them. Marge looks the same because Homer's memory of Marge is frozen at the moment the vending machine fell. His friends don't change because his memory of them is a static image from a specific moment in time, and his unconscious mind can generate variations on that image but cannot update it with information. Homer wasn't present to receive. Of course, Homer's children don't age in his dream. He was never there to watch them grow. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them as teenagers or adults because it has no experiential reference point for what that would look like. It can only hold them at the ages they were on the last day Homer was aware of the world. A coma preserves the dreaming mind in the amber of its last waking moment. Homer's last waking moment was the 1st of April 1993. Everything since has been the amber. There is another piece of evidence for this theory that is harder to dismiss than the tonal shift or the aging question, because it involves the show's own direct engagement with the theory. In season 34, the writers created a scene in which Homer wakes up from a coma, and the revelation that all of his outlandish experiences were just a dream is played out on screen. The scene was presented as a deleted scene that had been leaked by hackers. It appeared on social media. Fans responded with a mixture of delight and suspicion. The show's producers then confirmed it was a fabricated scene, a planted fake, not canonical. But they made it. They sat down and wrote and animated and voiced a scene depicting Homer waking from a coma and the entire show being revealed as a dream. They made this scene, they kept it, and then they released it into the culture as a denial. As if the point was not to confirm the theory but to acknowledge it in a way that couldn't be used as confirmation. The show knew about the theory. The show engaged with the theory. And the show chose to engage with it through a piece of content that depicted the theory as true, then claimed the depiction was fiction. Al Jean, who has been the show's executive producer for much of its run, addressed the coma theory directly in 2015. He stated that it was not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. He said Homer is not in a coma. He didn't explain why nobody ages. He didn't explain the tonal shift after season 4. He didn't explain why the show's plots have become progressively more dreamlike and consequence-free as the decades have passed. He didn't explain God's prophecy or the specific timing of the coma episode. He said the theory is wrong, and the conversation ended there. But the theory didn't end there, because the theory doesn't need the writers to confirm it. The theory lives inside the show itself, in the gap between what the show tells you is happening and what the structure of the show actually implies. And the gap is large enough and consistent enough and specific enough that it refuses to close regardless of what the producers say. There is one more dimension to the coma theory that deserves attention before we move forward: the emotional dimension. If Homer is dreaming, if everything since 1993 is the internal experience of an unconscious man, then what is the dream about? It's about his family, not about adventure, not about the celebrity encounters or the space travel or the secret societies or the foreign countries. The through line of every episode, the thing that holds the dream together across 30-plus years of increasingly surreal content, is Homer's relationship with Marge, his relationship with Bart, his relationship with Lisa, and his relationship with the baby he barely got to know before everything stopped. The dream gives Homer everything he couldn't bear to lose. It gives him Marge, who still loves him, who is still patient and warm and present. It gives him Bart, still 10 years old, still mischievous, still his boy. It gives him Lisa, still playing her saxophone in her room, still 8, still his daughter, who is smarter than he can understand but loves him anyway. It gives him Maggie, still small enough to hold, still a baby, still needing protection. The dream preserves them all in amber, exactly as they were, exactly as Homer needs them to be. No goodbyes. No growing up. No Bart becoming a teenager and pulling away. No Lisa leaving for a university in another city. No Maggie growing into a person who doesn't need him anymore. No Marge getting older and Homer getting older beside her and the house feeling quieter year by year. None of that. Just the family, whole and present and unchanged, in the yellow house on Evergreen Terrace, with the beer cold in the fridge and the television on and the children in the next room. The coma theory doesn't make The Simpsons a tragedy. It makes it the most loving thing a man's unconscious mind could create. A man who woke up from a crash and went under again before he could say goodbye, generating the only thing worth dreaming about, for 36 years, one episode at a time. And Homer always makes it home by the end of the episode. Always. No matter what happens, no matter how far the adventure takes him, Homer comes home. He walks through the door of the yellow house, and the family is there, and the loop closes, and everything is all right for one more week. Because his mind cannot imagine it ending. Because imagining it ending means finding out what's on the other side. And on the other side of Homer's dream is a hospital room, and fluorescent lights, and the faces of his family older than he remembers, and an indeterminate number of years that have passed without him. Or nothing at all. Homer's dream keeps running because stopping is too frightening to contemplate. And every episode, every week, every time the couch gag plays and the family piles onto that orange sofa, it's one more week of the dream holding. One more week of Evergreen Terrace. One more week of Marge and the kids, and the cold beer and the television. One more week of home. Sleep on that for a while. Let Springfield be quiet around you. We'll be moving to a darker corner of this town next, to a mystery that has never actually been resolved, and a crime that may have been covered up by the most powerful forces in Springfield's history. The Shooting, Season 6, Episode 25. The Summer of 1995. The Simpsons pulled off something that had genuinely never been attempted by an animated television program before, a real mystery. A constructed, deliberately clued, nationally promoted whodunit cliffhanger designed with enough evidence to be theoretically solvable and enough misdirection to ensure that almost nobody solved it. America spent the summer of 1995 trying to figure out who shot Mr. Burns. Fox treated it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, presenting the fictional shooting as if it were a real unsolved crime. The show ran a national contest, offering the winner the prize of being animated into a future episode. Thousands of entries were submitted. Critics and fans dissected every frame of the cliffhanger. Theories circulated on early internet forums, in newspaper columns, at office conversations. The show had given everyone a mechanism for their suspicion, too. By the end of Part 1, every major character in Springfield had a documented motive. Homer, because Burns had never in their years of working together managed to remember his name. Bart and Lisa, because the oil well Burns drilled beneath Springfield Elementary had gutted the school's budget. Grandpa Simpson, because the resulting sinkhole from that drilling operation had destroyed the Springfield retirement castle. Groundskeeper Willie, because the operation had cost him his job. Tito Puente, the musician, because Burns had eliminated the school's music program. Moe, because Burns had ruined his bar financially. Even Smithers, Burns's devoted and long-suffering personal assistant, had a motive. Burns had fired Smithers on the day of the shooting, doing so publicly and with characteristic coldness over Smithers's refusal to support Burns's plan to block the sun over Springfield. That plan, the centerpiece of what Burns called his masterwork, was the proximate cause of his shooting. Burns had constructed a giant mechanical disc and used it to block sunlight from reaching Springfield, intending to force every resident to buy electricity from his plant rather than rely on solar power. Not metaphorically, literally. He stole the sun from a town. By the time the town meeting where Burns was confronted ended, several characters had been shown holding visible weapons. The community had reached its limit. The air was thick with something that felt, even for a cartoon, like real danger. Burns staggered out of the meeting and collapsed against the town's sundial, his hands falling against specific letters as he slipped into unconsciousness. W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective, looking up at the dial from below, M and S, the screen went black. America waited. When Part 2 aired in September of 1995, the resolution unfolded through a comedic procedural investigation. Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police stumbled through the case with their characteristic combination of overconfidence and incompetence. Smithers immediately confessed, which seemed to close the case instantly, except that Smithers's alibi proved impossible to shake. He had been blackout drunk at the time of the shooting and had actually shot someone else entirely, firing a bullet into old Jasper's wooden leg at a completely different location, nowhere near the scene of the crime. The investigation continued. Suspects were eliminated one by one. The evidence trail eventually led to Homer, whose fingerprints were found on the murder weapon and whose DNA matched a trace found on Burns's jacket. Homer was arrested. He was on the verge of conviction. And then Burns woke up. He identified his shooter. It was Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson. According to Burns's account, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the meeting, attempted to take her lollipop, and in the scuffle his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. the case was closed. Chief Wiggum noted, with the philosophical resignation of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by anything, that no jury in the world would convict a baby. Maybe Texas, he added, but the point stood. The case was closed, the charges against Homer were dropped, and Springfield went home. Except the case was never actually closed. Not really. Let's look at the contest results, because they tell a story that the show's own creators have confirmed and that most people have never fully absorbed. The national contest produced thousands of entries. The show's producers, acknowledging this on the DVD commentary for the episodes, stated that they randomly sampled a portion of the entries to determine a winner. From that sample, they found not a single correct answer. Nobody in the randomly selected sample had guessed Maggie. The winner was chosen randomly from the pool without having submitted the correct answer and received a cash payment in lieu of the animation appearance because the prize required the correct answer. The producers were aware of one person who had posted the correct answer to an online Simpsons news group on the night the cliffhanger aired. This person used a university internet account that was no longer active by the time the contest ended. The producers went looking for them and couldn't find them. They included an open invitation for this person to come forward on the DVD release. As far as anyone knows, they never did. So the show's creators promoted a national mystery, told the public it was solvable from the clues presented in Part 1, ran a major contest around it, and then when the answer was revealed, essentially 0 people in the random sample had solved it. One person had posted the correct answer online the night it aired, and that person has never been publicly identified. Either the clues were genuinely insufficient to support the correct answer, or the misdirection was too effective, or the answer didn't follow logically from the evidence the way the show implied it did. All 3 of those possibilities are worth sitting with. Now let's look at the specific evidence. The sundial. Burns falls and his hands land on W and S. From his perspective, M and S. The show presents this as a dying man spelling out his attacker's initials. Maggie Simpson. M.S. Except Burns himself, in the resolution episode, stated explicitly that his positioning on the sundial was not intentional. He did not deliberately fall in a way designed to communicate a clue. He just fell. The sundial letters were a coincidence. The single most discussed clue in the mystery was explicitly described by the victim as meaningless. The gun. Burns was carrying a gun in a holster, and that holster was shown to be empty before the shooting. His gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon, which means the shooter was someone who encountered Burns's fallen gun by chance, rather than someone who arrived at the meeting intending violence. This actually does fit the profile of a baby finding a gun on the ground, but it fits the profile of quite a few other characters too. Anyone who wasn't carrying a weapon to the meeting, anyone who was present in the parking lot area, anyone who might have encountered Burns outside the meeting and found the fallen gun before Burns recovered it. Burns's last words before being shot were, reportedly, some variation of recognition, the implication being that he knew his attacker. He saw them and recognized them before the shot was fired. This recognition was not fearful or surprised. It was casual, the easy recognition of someone familiar. Does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? The show has never established a relationship between Burns and the Simpson baby. Burns barely registers Homer's existence after decades of direct employment. The idea that Burns would look at an infant in a parking lot and register her with a calm, familiar recognition feels inconsistent with his characterization. Then there's the season 18 confession. In a much later episode, Homer claims on-screen in dialogue that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Nobody follows up on a confession to the attempted murder of the most powerful man in Springfield. It's treated as a throwaway line, a character beat that the narrative doesn't engage with. Homer could be lying. Homer lies and exaggerates routinely, and claiming credit for dramatic events is consistent with his character. But the show's choice to include that line and then move past it without consequence is either sloppy writing or a deliberate breadcrumb. And the show, particularly in its golden seasons, was not known for sloppy writing. The alternate ending is another piece of evidence that sits uncomfortably with the official resolution. A complete alternate version of the conclusion was animated with Smithers as the shooter. Full length, fully voiced, fully produced. This isn't a storyboard or a discarded draft. The show created a finished alternate reality in which someone other than Maggie pulled the trigger, complete enough to be screened as a segment on a clip show. In that clip show, the Smithers ending is dismissed by the host, the fictional Troy McClure, who notes that accepting it would require ignoring all the Simpson DNA evidence, which he describes as downright nutty. He delivers this line while referencing the O.J. Simpson trial, which had recently concluded with a verdict that many observers felt required exactly that kind of evidence dismissal. The show is winking. It's telling you, through the voice of a fictional host dismissing a fictional alternate ending, that evidence can be ignored when powerful interests prefer a particular outcome. It's telling you that the official answer and the true answer are not always the same thing. It's using the O.J. Simpson trial as its reference point for this observation, which is not a subtle choice. The most compelling alternate theory focuses on Marge. Marge had watched Burns systematically dismantle everything that mattered to her family. The school budget that funded her children's education, the money her family dog needed for surgery, the light that reached her home and her yard. She watched a single wealthy man make a series of purely self-interested decisions that degraded the quality of life for everyone she loved, and she had no formal mechanism for stopping him. The theory suggests that Marge went to the town meeting not planning violence, but reached a breaking point in the parking lot afterward. That she was not carrying a weapon, which is consistent with the evidence about Burns's gun already being missing from its holster. That Burns saw her and recognized her not as a threat but as Homer's wife, a familiar face, and that recognition explains the calm, unsurprised nature of his acknowledgement before the shot. And then the theory suggests something more specific about why the official investigation never landed on Marge. Burns, when he woke up and was asked to identify his attacker, pointed at the sundial and let the authorities draw their own conclusions. He did not name Marge. And the theory argues that Burns's failure to name the real shooter was not confusion or amnesia, but a deliberate choice, because Burns was infatuated with Marge. In an earlier episode, Burns had developed a significant and unwanted attachment to Marge. The experience had clearly made an impression on him. The theory argues that when Burns woke up in the hospital and faced the question of who had shot him, he could not bring himself to condemn the woman he had once, in his way, cared for. So, he deflected. He pointed at the sundial. He let Maggie become the answer because Maggie was a convenient answer. A baby cannot be prosecuted. A baby cannot be imprisoned. A baby absorbs the official blame and releases the actual perpetrator without consequence to anyone except the official record. Maggie became the answer because Maggie was safe. The question of what actually happened in that parking lot remains, nearly 30 years later, genuinely open. There is one more piece of evidence from the episode itself that the theory asks you to look at one more time. The final shot of part 2. Everyone has left the room where Burns made his identification. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully, checking her surroundings, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as a confession. Maggie did it, and she knows what she did. But there is another way to read that shot. A baby who was present when someone fired a gun. A baby who saw the motion, registered it, stored it in the way babies store novel physical actions they witness. A baby who, left alone in a quiet room, retrieves the stored action and reenacts it the way babies reenact things they have observed. Maggie isn't confessing. She's remembering what she saw. She was in the parking lot. She saw what happened. She is 1 year old, and she cannot tell anyone what she saw, and she cannot correct the record, and so she sits in the empty room and moves her pacifier and holds the truth in the only way a baby can hold anything, in silence. Springfield closed this case because Springfield needed it to be closed. The most powerful man in town had been shot, and someone needed to be accountable for it. And someone needed to be accountable in a way that didn't require the town to confront the fact that its social contract had failed badly enough that an act of violence against an elderly billionaire felt, to a significant portion of its population, like a reasonable response to events. Maggie was that someone. She is the only person in Springfield who could be identified as a shooter and then walked away from without consequence, without imprisonment, without any disruption to the existing social order. She was the perfect resolution, not the true one, the useful one. And Burns, who woke up from a coma and could have named whoever he wanted, chose to point at a sundial and let the town make its own meaning. Whether that was confusion or calculation, whether Burns was protecting someone or simply couldn't remember, we don't know. The show doesn't say. The case is officially closed and informally open, and that gap between the official and the real is the space where the truth lives in Springfield. It always lives there. Let the mystery sit quietly. Let it hum in the background of everything else we know about this town. We'll move forward now, to the man at the center of the whole system. The man who owns the plant and employs Homer, and may have been keeping secrets about his own survival since before most of Springfield was born. How is Mr. Burns still alive? That's where we're going next. Charles Montgomery Burns. The show has never committed firmly to his exact age, because committing to it would require confronting the implications. But the canonical evidence, across dozens of episodes and decades of accumulated reference, places his birth somewhere in the 1880s. He has shared personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described events from the early 1900s not as historical knowledge but as lived experience. He served in World War II, which means he was a functioning adult in the early 1940s. By the most conservative estimate that the show's internal timeline can support, Burns is approximately 130 years old. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates the political structure of his town with sustained sophistication. He holds grudges across decades. He executes long-range plans that require sustained cognitive engagement and an accurate working model of current financial and legal reality. His physical form is ancient and frail, yes. He has the skeletal build of a man whose body has been trying to give up for a very long time. His physical strength is essentially non-existent. Smithers has to manage nearly every aspect of his physical environment on his behalf, but his mind is sharp in a way that Homer's never has been and Bart's never will be. Burns is, by any honest assessment of the evidence, the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield. He plans. He anticipates. He manipulates systems with a patience and a precision that presupposes a long perspective on human behavior, the kind of perspective you only develop when you've been watching humans for longer than most humans get to live. How is he still alive? The show addresses this most directly in the Springfield Files episode, where Homer mistakes Burns for an alien in the woods. The mystery of the glowing figure resolves when it's revealed that Burns undergoes weekly medical treatment so extreme, so saturated with chemicals and radiation protocols, that his body emits visible light in the hours immediately following a session. The treatments keep him alive for exactly one more week. Miss one, and Burns dies. The margin for error is 0. His continued existence is maintained by a recurring medical intervention with a precision and a consistency that he could not manage without dedicated support, which is, among other things, the deepest and most practical explanation for Smithers. Wayland Smithers has been devoted to Burns in a way that the show has always presented as emotional, but which functions operationally as medical dependency. Smithers manages Burns' schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every appointment. Smithers monitors Burns' condition with a vigilance that exceeds anything you'd expect from an executive assistant and approaches what you'd expect from a full-time caregiver. Smithers knows the treatment protocol. He knows what happens if a session is missed, and he has structured his entire life around ensuring that a session is never missed. Burns' emotional hold on Smithers is real, but underneath the emotional hold is a practical reality that the show rarely states directly. Without Smithers, Burns' logistical management collapses. Without logistical management, Burns misses a treatment. Without the treatment, Burns' disease equilibrium fails. Without the equilibrium, Burns is dead within days. Smithers isn't just devoted, he is structurally indispensable, and he knows it, and Burns knows it. And the knowledge sits between them like a foundation, rarely examined, never directly acknowledged, holding the entire relationship up from underneath. Now let's talk about the diseases. In one of the most famous scenes in the show's history, Burns visits a doctor who informs him that he has every disease known to medical science, every single one, simultaneously present in his body. The doctor explains that these diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium, each one attempting to kill Burns and being blocked in that attempt by every other disease doing the same thing. He describes this as Three Stooges syndrome. 3 people trying to fit through a doorway at once. None of them can get through because they're all blocking each other. The conclusion is that Burns is, paradoxically, the sickest man in America, and the most difficult man to kill. Every illness that should end him is being held in check by every other illness trying to do the same. The scene is played for comedy. It is one of the show's most quoted moments. But if you apply the radiation theory to it, the comedy reveals a logic that is quietly terrifying. Burns's disease equilibrium is not natural. No biological system maintains perfect stasis among dozens of competing pathological conditions through unaided organic processes. What's maintaining the stasis is the weekly radiation treatment. The treatment isn't curing Burns's diseases. It cannot cure them. It's managing the balance among them. It's adjusting the conditions inside Burns's body in a way that prevents any single pathology from gaining enough advantage to cause acute system failure. It's nuclear maintenance applied to human biology. Burns's body is, in the most literal sense the metaphor can bear, a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. He doesn't need to be healthy, he needs to stay in balance. And the radiation sustains that balance in a system that has been so thoroughly altered by a century of radiation exposure that it can no longer sustain anything through normal biological mechanisms. He is powered by the thing that is killing everyone else. This creates a dynamic that the show never quite names but depicts with remarkable consistency. Burns understands radiation. He has understood it intimately, personally, biologically, for over a century. He knows what controlled exposure does to biological tissue because controlled exposure is keeping him alive. He knows what uncontrolled exposure does to a population because uncontrolled exposure is what his plant has been administering to Springfield for decades. He has been his own experiment and his town's experiment simultaneously. He has observed both outcomes from the privileged vantage of the one person in Springfield with access to effective management. He manages his own exposure with weekly clinical precision and extraordinary private medical resources. He manages Springfield's exposure by ensuring that no one investigates what the plant is actually releasing into the environment, by employing a safety inspector specifically unqualified to catch violations, and by maintaining sufficient control over the town's political and economic infrastructure to prevent any effective regulatory response. Burns isn't just benefiting from the contamination of Springfield. He is, in a very specific and terrible sense, the reason it exists in the form it does. The town could have been cleaned up. The violations could have been addressed. Homer could have been replaced with someone competent. Every single step in the chain that leads from the plant to the contaminated water, to the yellow skin, to the four fingers, to the three-eyed fish has a decision point where Burns made a deliberate choice to leave the problem in place. He made those choices knowing, at a biological level, that nobody else in Springfield had access to, exactly what the problem was doing to the people living downstream of it. Let's talk about the historical record. Burns's memories span a range of American history that no single living person should be able to claim. He remembers the Gilded Age, not as history but as personal experience. He attended Yale. He served in World War II. He knew Howard Hughes. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and maintained possession of it for decades. The show depicts him as having been personally involved in, or at least personally proximate to, an extraordinary range of historical events across more than a century of American life. He references figures who have been dead for 70 years with the casual familiarity of someone who knew them. His institutional knowledge of American finance and politics extends back to a period when most of those institutions were being invented, and his family's history goes back further than that. The Burns dynasty, as the show depicts it, is one of the oldest and most continuously powerful private fortunes in American history. The family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. It was old money when old money was still being made. The kind of wealth that doesn't just accumulate over generations, but actively shapes the conditions that allow it to accumulate further. The kind of wealth that builds infrastructure and then charges everyone else to use it. The kind of wealth that understands, at a structural level, that power is not maintained through individual excellence, but through system design. Burns inherited this legacy. He has been extending it for over a century. And the show never quite asks whether Burns is a continuation of a family pattern or an anomaly within it. Whether the Burns dynasty has always found ways to extend lifespans beyond the normal human range. Whether the radiation treatments Burns relies on are a recent innovation or the current form of something much older. The question the show raises but never resolves is whether Burns is unique in his longevity or whether he is the latest iteration of something the Burns family has been doing for a very long time. Before the nuclear era, before the radiation protocols, before the medical infrastructure that currently keeps Burns in biological suspension, what did the Burns family do to maintain their grip on power across generations? The show doesn't say, but it does establish that their wealth and influence have been continuous for longer than most American institutions have existed, and that kind of continuity doesn't happen through normal generational succession. Either the Burns family has been extraordinarily lucky for 3 centuries, or they have always taken extraordinary measures. There's one more piece of the Burns immortality question that deserves attention, and it's the piece that connects most directly to the town he owns. The show makes clear, across multiple episodes and from multiple angles, that Springfield cannot survive without Burns. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns. Burns depends on his treatments. His treatments depend on the infrastructure his wealth provides. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which each component is necessary to the others, and the removal of any one of them causes the entire structure to fail. Burns is not kept alive by medicine alone. Burns is kept alive by the economic and social necessity of his continued existence. Springfield needs him alive, not in the sentimental sense that a town might need an elder statesman or a community institution. In the practical sense that his absence would immediately trigger the collapse of the employment and power infrastructure that the town depends on. He is too expensive to die. The town has been paying the bill for his survival in the coin of contaminated water and mutated biology, and a collective cognitive fog that makes it impossible to see the bill clearly for as long as he has been running the plant. And Burns is aware of this. He has always been aware of this. He has structured Springfield's dependency on him deliberately over decades, because a population that cannot survive without you is a population that will never meaningfully challenge you. A town that needs your plant to function cannot afford to investigate what your plant is doing to them. A workforce that cannot find other employment cannot afford to quit. A community that has no power source except yours cannot afford to lose you. Springfield is not Burns's home. Springfield is Burns's apparatus, and the apparatus has been running, with occasional maintenance and occasional malfunction, but without any fundamental breakdown in its function, since before anyone currently alive in the show's universe was born. Burns is the oldest man in Springfield. He might be the oldest man in America. He glows in the dark on Tuesdays after his treatments. He moves through his town like a ghost that hasn't realized it no longer belongs to the world it's haunting. He looks at the people around him with a mix of contempt and indifference. That is the natural attitude of someone who has been alive long enough to see everyone important to them die, and everyone important to them after that die too. And he keeps going, because the machine keeps going, and the machine needs him to keep going. And as long as the treatments arrive on schedule, and Smithers manages the logistics, and Homer falls asleep at his workstation, and the cooling towers leak, and the water flows through the pipes, and the town wakes up every morning without memory of what it was being done to yesterday, the machine will keep going. Forever, or close enough to forever that the difference is purely theoretical. Take a breath. Let Burns's manor house recede into the distance. Let Springfield come back into focus around you. Quieter now. The lights dimmed a little. We're going to spend some time with the smallest member of the Simpson family next. The one who doesn't speak. The one who has been watching everything, from the very beginning, from the safest vantage point available. The one who might understand more about Springfield than anyone else in it. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk without falling. She communicates primarily through pacifier sounds and the occasional deliberate stare. She is carried, pushed in a stroller, bounced on laps, held in arms. She is, by every visible measurement, entirely dependent on the adults around her for survival. And in that time, in that small body, behind that large pacifier, she has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot the most powerful man in Springfield. Whether she meant to or not, and we've already examined why the answer to that question is far less settled than the official record suggests, the act is attributed to her. She put a bullet in Charles Montgomery Burns and walked away without consequence. She was 1 year old. She led a daycare rebellion, a theatrical short film called The Longest Daycare, released in 2012 and nominated for an Academy Award, shows Maggie at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a facility run with the authoritarian efficiency of a small dictatorship. Inside, Maggie identifies a caterpillar about to become a butterfly. Another infant, a bully, wants to destroy it. Maggie decides to protect it. What follows is a 7-minute wordless action sequence in which a baby outmaneuvers adult staff members, security systems, and an aggressive peer in order to shepherd one vulnerable creature to safety. She does this through pure observation and planning, reading the environment around her with the attention of someone who has been studying it for a long time. She succeeds. No words, no adult assistance. A baby alone, solving a multi-stage problem that would challenge an adult, operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot yet support, and succeeding because the gap between what her body can do and what her mind can do doesn't actually constrain her. Her mind finds the workaround, every time. There's a detail in The Longest Daycare that the theory about Maggie asks you to sit with. When Maggie is navigating the facility, she pauses at specific moments and observes. She doesn't rush, she doesn't react. She watches, she processes, she waits for the right angle to reveal itself, and then she moves. This is not how babies navigate problems. Babies react. Babies respond to immediate sensory information. They do not observe a situation from multiple angles, model the likely behavior of the people in the room, identify the optimal moment for action, and then execute. That's what Maggie does. The theory about Maggie is not primarily about her intelligence, although her intelligence is part of it. The theory is about her silence, about what the silence means, why it exists, and what it might be protecting. Look at what happens to intelligent women in the Simpson family. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. Genuinely, measurably brilliant. Her IQ has been tested across multiple episodes, and the numbers are consistently extraordinary. She reads widely and retains everything. She argues from evidence. She applies complex reasoning to real problems. She challenges authority when authority is wrong, and she is right often enough that being right starts to feel like its own kind of burden. And what has that intelligence gotten her? Isolation. Mockery from her peers, dismissal from adults, exhaustion from carrying the weight of being the only person in a room who can see the problem clearly. Lisa speaks and gets talked over. Lisa argues and gets dismissed. Lisa demonstrates her intelligence openly, consistently, visibly, and the community around her responds not with recognition, but with the faintly hostile impatience of people who would prefer not to be made to feel less than. Her intelligence is her most defining characteristic and her most socially costly one. Maggie has watched this. Maggie has been watching this since before she was old enough to hold her own head up. She has observed her sister's brilliance, and she has observed what Springfield does with brilliance when it's offered openly. She has watched the smartest person in the family spend her entire childhood being punished for being smart, and she has drawn a conclusion from the observation. Silence is safer. Invisibility is a more effective form of armor than visibility. The less they notice you, the more you can do. The more you can do, the more effective you actually are. Lisa announces her intelligence and gets resisted. Maggie conceals hers and gets the access that invisibility provides. Nobody monitors a baby carefully enough to catch what a baby is doing if the baby is careful about when it acts. Nobody suspects a baby of planning. Nobody expects a baby to have an agenda. The most effective cover a highly capable mind can have in Springfield is also the most obvious one. Look exactly like what everyone expects you to be. Look dependent, look passive, look like you're just along for the ride. Every time Maggie does something remarkable, the family doesn't notice. The community doesn't notice. Burns was shot, and the investigation focused on everyone except the infant, because who seriously investigates a baby? The daycare rebellion succeeded because infants are not surveilled with the same attention as people who are understood to be agents. Every heroic action Maggie takes happens in the space that invisibility creates, and she maintains that invisibility through 36 years of deliberate, strategic, immaculate performance of helplessness. She is not helpless. She has never been helpless. She is the Simpson who figured out how to be powerful without being seen. There's the episode where Maggie is tested, and the results of the test suggest an intelligence so far beyond the normal range that the testing instrument essentially cannot place an upper bound on it. The family is told. They respond with brief surprise and then move on to the next disaster. The information doesn't integrate into how they treat Maggie because Maggie doesn't act in ways that remind them of it. She goes back to the pacifier. She goes back to the wide eyes and the small sounds. She goes back to being the baby because being the baby is the safest thing she can be. Connect this to the radiation theory for a moment. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces mutations, and if those mutations affect different people differently based on factors we can only partially trace, then Maggie and Homer represent the two extreme poles of a single spectrum. Homer's mutation diminished, Maggie's amplified. Homer lost cognitive function to the contamination. Maggie gained it. The same environmental poison that made Homer incapable of sustained complex reasoning produced in his youngest daughter, a mind that operates at a level nobody around her can recognize, let alone match. Homer and Maggie are the same story told in opposite directions. The environment broke one and built the other, and neither of them is aware of the symmetry, which is itself a remarkably efficient arrangement from the radiation theory's perspective. Homer, cognitively diminished, provides the cover at the plant. Maggie, cognitively extraordinary, provides the potential for the arrangement to one day be challenged. But Maggie has seen what happens to people who challenge things in Springfield. She has watched the real Seymour Skinner get tied to a train and exiled. She has watched Lisa's attempts at reform produce nothing but exhaustion. She has watched every person who tried to make Springfield confront its own reality get dismissed, defeated, or removed. So she waits. And watching Maggie wait is the most patient and the most unsettling thing the show has ever asked its audience to do. Her first word was, "Daddy." It happened once, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a brief cameo, and was never repeated. Maggie spoke, the word was heard, and then she returned to silence. Not because she couldn't say it again, because she chose not to. She controls this. She decides what comes out and what doesn't. The pacifier is not a comfort object. It is a choice. It is the visible symbol of a decision made by an intelligence that has correctly assessed the environment and determined that the risks of revelation outweigh the benefits. When Maggie finally decides to act, when she decides that the moment is right and the silence has served its purpose, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will see it coming, because that's exactly what she has been designing for 36 years. A situation where she holds all the relevant information and none of the relevant scrutiny. The coma theory adds one more dimension to Maggie's character that is almost too much to carry. If Homer is dreaming, if Springfield is the projection of an unconscious man who went under in 1993 and never surfaced, then Maggie is what Homer most urgently needed her to be. She is the child he couldn't protect. The youngest, the most vulnerable, the one he had the least time with before the vending machine fell and the dream began. He couldn't see her grow up. He couldn't watch her develop. He couldn't learn what she would become. So in the dream, he made her extraordinary. He gave her an intelligence that transcends her age because he needed, on some level deeper than language, to believe that she would be all right without him. That the baby he left behind was capable of anything. That she didn't need him as much as he needed to believe she needed him. Homer made Maggie a genius because a genius doesn't need protecting. And a man who woke up one day and found himself unable to reach his family needed, more than anything, to believe that the smallest one was going to be fine. Her genius is a father's prayer, made concrete in the dream. Whether Springfield is a dream or a contaminated reality, Maggie is the Simpson who has been carrying the most while revealing the least. The one who watches everything. The one who remembers everything. The one who sits in the quiet room after everyone else has left and moves her pacifier in the shape of a truth she cannot yet speak. What she does with everything she's been collecting, all the observation and the intelligence and the silence and the patience, that's the last unsolved mystery of the Simpson family. And maybe that's exactly how she planned it. Rest with Maggie for a moment. The baby in the crib at the top of the stairs, eyes wide open in the dark, watching the house breathe around her, knowing everything, saying nothing, waiting for whatever comes next. We'll move forward in a moment. We're going to talk about predictions, about the strange phenomenon of a cartoon show that keeps appearing to forecast the future, and about what the real explanation says about the relationship between satire and reality. There is a version of The Simpsons that exists primarily in screenshots. This version of the show lives on social media, in meme compilations and viral posts, in the breathless framing of the phrase you've seen 1,000 times by now. The Simpsons predicted this. The Simpsons knew. And the evidence, at first glance, is genuinely hard to dismiss. In the year 2000, in an episode called Bart to the Future, the show depicted a future America in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. And in that same episode, the president she succeeds, the man whose administration she's inheriting when she takes office, is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump's election victory. 16 years before the result that shocked most political observers, the show depicted a Trump presidency as the logical, satirical conclusion of the direction American celebrity culture was heading. And then American celebrity culture headed exactly in that direction. In 1995, an episode depicted a device worn on the wrist that functioned as a two-way video communication tool with computing capabilities. It looked, in the drawings of that particular production team in that particular year, remarkably like a smartwatch. The Apple Watch was announced 19 years later. In a 1994 episode, Homer travels to space alongside Buzz Aldrin, decades before commercial space tourism became something private citizens could reasonably expect to participate in. In a 1993 episode, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply shortages, a frantic search for a cure, and the accidental release of a swarm of unusually aggressive insects into the environment, which felt bizarrely precise in the context of a pandemic year that also featured a sudden public concern about murder hornets arriving from Asia. In 1996, a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra became reality in 2024 when Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the event it appeared to predict. In 1998, the show depicted Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox as a satire of accelerating media consolidation. Disney acquired 20th Century Fox in 2019. The list continues. The show's own writers have noted it, mostly with an air of bemused deflection. Al Jean, the longtime executive producer, has described the phenomenon as throwing enough darts that some of them were bound to hit bullseyes. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most creatively accomplished seasons, put it more plainly. It's mainly coincidence because the episodes are so old that history repeats itself. This is the honest answer. This is the answer that a thoughtful, intellectually honest person who has examined the actual evidence gives. And it's worth taking seriously, because the mechanism it describes is real. 788 episodes over 36 years. Each episode containing dozens of jokes, satirical observations, extrapolated cultural trends, imagined technologies, speculative political scenarios. When you generate that much content over that long a period, some of it is going to line up with subsequent real events. That's not mysticism, that's statistics. Fact-checking organizations that have examined the most widely circulated prediction claims have consistently found that the majority of them are either overstated, dependent on selective framing, or based on trends that were already clearly visible when the episodes were written. The Trump presidency was not predicted from nothing. Trump had been publicly discussing a potential presidential run since at least 1988. By 2000, when the episode aired, he had flirted with candidacy seriously enough that political commentators were already treating the possibility as a real, if unlikely, future event. The writers didn't see the future. They saw the present and pushed it one step further. The Disney-Fox prediction was not a leap from nothing either. Media consolidation had been accelerating as a trend for years before the episode aired. The idea that the largest entertainment companies would continue consuming smaller ones was an observation about momentum already in motion. The specific prediction about Disney and Fox may have been a guess, but it was a highly educated guess by writers who paid close attention to industry dynamics. The smartwatch wasn't a prediction. Wrist-mounted computing devices had been a recurring subject of design speculation for decades. The writers of that episode were not imagining something that had never been imagined. They were drawing on a well-established tradition of technology speculation that the actual tech industry was pursuing concurrently. So the official debunking holds for most of the list. High-volume output, educated writers, trend extrapolation, confirmation bias that makes people remember the hits and forget the misses. 788 episodes is enough darts that some of them were always going to land in interesting places. But then there are a few cases where the debunking feels less complete. The Trump prediction didn't just name a general type. It named a specific person, placed them in a specific office, and in the visual staging of the episode, showed a character descending an escalator in a manner that closely mirrors Trump's actual campaign announcement in 2015. The shot of a fictional character descending an escalator to announce a candidacy, and then the actual footage of Trump descending an escalator to announce his candidacy 15 years later, are close enough that the coincidence requires more explanation than pure statistical chance can comfortably provide. The Siegfried and Roy episode didn't just gesture at the general danger of exotic animals. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers specifically. In 2003, Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers. That level of specificity is harder to attribute to coincidence alone, and the mathematical content. In 1998, the show included an equation written on a blackboard by a character that appears to have predicted the mass of the Higgs boson particle. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes a theory about the universe having a toroidal shape, one resembling a donut. In 2015, cosmologists working with data from the Planck satellite found patterns in the cosmic microwave background that are at least consistent with a universe shaped like a torus, a donut. The show was either extremely lucky or it employed writers who were thinking about cosmological questions with a sophistication that most audiences didn't register as significant at the time. This is where the most interesting theory about the predictions diverges from both the conspiracy version and the pure coincidence version. The Simpsons doesn't predict the future. The Simpsons shapes the future, not through magic, not through any mechanism that requires beliefs that physics can't accommodate, through the straightforward, demonstrable process of cultural influence at scale. The Simpsons is one of the most deeply embedded cultural artifacts in American life. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have become part of the language. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand their own institutions. Its characters have become reference points that transcend the medium they originated in. When the show makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the culture. It circulates. It becomes a reference point. It makes the idea feel familiar, rehearsed, like something that has already been processed and set aside, rather than something shocking and new. The joke doesn't predict the presidency. The joke makes the presidency feel inevitable before it happens. It primes the cultural imagination. It normalizes the scenario. When the scenario arrives, the reaction isn't quite shock, because the culture has already absorbed a version of it. There's a sense of recognition. This was always going to happen. We've known this was coming. The Simpsons already told us. But the show told you something slightly different than what actually happened. It told you a satire of the idea. It made you laugh at it. It processed it as an absurdity. And then when the absurdity became reality, the emotional framework you had for it was the one the show had constructed. Preemptive familiarity. A story you felt like you already knew the shape of. The show didn't predict the Disney acquisition. The show made media consolidation feel inevitable by treating it as obvious satire. When it happened, the cultural response wasn't surprise. It was a vague sense of courseness, a feeling that the direction had always been clear even to people who hadn't been paying close attention to industry trends. And part of that feeling came from having seen the idea played as a joke years earlier. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and people stared into it long enough that they started to resemble what they saw. The nuclear power plant with its corrupt owner, and its incompetent safety systems and its indifferent government oversight, the billionaire who controls the town's economic life and faces no meaningful accountability, the population too tired and too distracted to notice the patterns that should alarm them, the collective amnesia that allows the same disasters to recycle without triggering real change. These were satirical observations when the show first made them, exaggerations for comic effect. Over time, the exaggerations have closed toward reality rather than reality pulling away from them. Springfield in 1989 was a caricature. Springfield in 2025 is starting to feel like a description. The prediction phenomenon is most interesting as a mirror. Not a magical predictive instrument, but an honest artistic one. The show was made by highly educated observers of American culture who wrote about what they saw with precision and wit and a willingness to follow trends to their logical extremes. Some of those extremes arrived. The ones that arrived became evidence of prophecy. The ones that didn't are forgotten. And the ones that arrived feel so specific, so eerily detailed, so uncannily close to subsequent events, that even knowing the mechanism, even accepting the statistical explanation, you sit back and look at the list and find yourself not quite comfortable. 788 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about the direction of American life, and enough bullseyes to make the show's own writers occasionally pause and wonder if they know something they shouldn't. Maybe they do. Maybe anyone who watches a culture carefully enough and writes about what they see honestly enough starts to develop something that feels, from the outside, like foresight. Maybe the difference between a sharp observation and a prediction is mostly a matter of how many years elapse before the observation is proven accurate. Or maybe the show has simply been running long enough that the world had time to catch up with its jokes. And the jokes, as it turned out, were not as exaggerated as anyone thought. Springfield, as a description of where America was heading, was a comedy in 1989. Whether it's still a comedy is a question the show leaves open in every episode it airs. Let that thought drift for a while. The mirror and the thing it's reflecting. The joke and the reality that followed it. We'll go somewhere more personal next, somewhere that connects Burns' empire to Homer's broken life through the most intimate kind of damage a wealthy man's grudge can do. We're going to talk about Homer's mother. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the established fact. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told him this when Homer was young. He had shown Homer a grave. Homer had mourned, grown up, and carried that loss into every aspect of his adult personality. The desperate neediness, the compulsive desire to be liked, the terror of abandonment, the willingness to absorb humiliation from his employer rather than risk the one stable thing he had. All of it, the shape of Homer's emotional life, traced back to a boy who believed his mother had died and grown up thinking she'd chosen to leave him by dying rather than stay. That belief shaped everything. Every clingy moment with Marge. Every desperate bid for his boss's attention and approval. Every time Homer responded to being ignored or belittled by a man who couldn't remember his name by shrugging it off and coming back the next day, Homer Simpson's personality is a coping mechanism for a wound that wasn't real. He spent decades managing the grief of a loss that hadn't happened. In Season 7, the episode called Mother Simpson revealed the truth. Homer's mother was alive. She had never died. The grave Abe had shown him belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been passing off a famous writer's headstone as his wife's burial site for Homer's entire life. The moment Homer finds his mother is one of the most genuinely emotional scenes in the show's history. A grown man and the woman who raised him, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. The reunion is quiet and overwhelming, in equal measure. And then Mona told Homer why she had left. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife in Springfield, married to Abe, mother to a young Homer. Ordinary, unremarkable in the way that lives often are before the event that defines them. The world outside Springfield was loud with the civil rights movement and the counterculture and the protests against Vietnam. The world inside Springfield was quieter. And then Mona changed. Or was changed. The show depicts this carefully, grounding the absurdity in genuine emotional weight. She became radicalized. She joined a group of activists and discovered that Charles Montgomery Burns, the man who owned the power plant that powered Springfield, also owned something else in town, a biological weapons laboratory. Let that settle. Burns didn't just own a nuclear facility with hundreds of safety violations leaking radiation into the water supply. He owned a research facility designed to develop and produce weapons-grade pathogens. In the same town, near the same school where Springfield's children went to class? Alongside the nuclear contamination, Burns was maintaining a germ warfare operation in the community he lorded over. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to destroy the biological material stored inside. The raid was successful. The pathogens were eliminated. The lab was effectively neutralized. During the escape, something went wrong. As the group fled, Mona stopped to help someone who had fallen in the chaos. The person she helped was Burns. She stopped to assist the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and in doing so, she made direct eye contact. Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. From that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family without leading federal authorities to them. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was leaving or comfort him through the confusion and the grief that followed her disappearance. She kissed Homer goodbye in his sleep and disappeared into the American underground for the next 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, and Homer spent the next 3 decades of his life believing he was the kind of child whose mother would rather leave than stay. The shape of Homer's emotional damage was set in that moment. The neediness, the desperate approval-seeking, the fear of abandonment, all of it is the specific shape of what happens to a child who wakes up and discovers the most important person in his world has vanished without explanation. Now here is where the conspiracy deepens. Burns didn't just report Mona to the FBI in 1969 and move on. He maintained his pursuit of her. He kept her file active. He held his grudge with the extraordinary patience of a man for whom a decade is a short time horizon. When Mona came back to Springfield in season 7, when she finally felt safe enough to return after nearly 3 decades, Burns spotted her almost immediately. He saw her through a cab window and called the authorities. The FBI arrived at the Simpson house. Mona had to flee again. Homer had to say goodbye to his mother for the second time, this time knowing why she was leaving, knowing who was forcing her out, knowing that the man responsible for her exile was the same man he had been handing his labor to for his entire adult life. Homer worked for Burns. Homer had always worked for Burns. Homer earned his salary from the man who destroyed his family. And Homer didn't connect these facts in a way that produced action. He didn't confront Burns. He didn't quit. He didn't refuse to return to work the following Monday. He processed the information and then, with the resignation of a man too cognitively impaired by decades of radiation exposure and a crayon lodged in his brain to build an effective chain of cause and effect, he went back to the plant. Homer's inability to make this connection is not played as a joke in Mother Simpson. It is played as the quiet horror it is. A man who has been working for his family's persecutor his entire adult life, and who cannot fully assemble the architecture of his own suffering into a shape that demands response. The radiation theory has a specific answer for why Homer cannot make this connection. But there's a deeper conspiracy here that the show reveals gradually across multiple episodes, and it connects Burns to Homer through a different channel entirely. Burns and Grandpa Simpson made a deal. At some point in the past, in the murky period before the events of the show, Abe Simpson discovered that Burns had committed a crime. The exact nature of the crime shifts slightly depending on which episode references it, but the structure of the arrangement that resulted is consistent. Burns had done something Abe knew about. Abe's silence was purchased, and the price of that silence was a guarantee. Homer would always have a job at the power plant, no matter how many mistakes he made. No matter how many safety violations he caused, no matter how many times he should have been fired, Homer was untouchable. This explains something that the show has used as a running joke, but which is actually, when you examine it, genuinely bizarre. Homer has 742 documented errors in his employee file. He has caused reactor incidents. He has fallen asleep during warning alarms. He has lost track of nuclear material. He has done every specific thing that should result in immediate termination, not just from this job, but from any job, and he has never been permanently let go. The German investors who briefly purchased the plant fired Homer within hours of the acquisition. Then they saw the cost of fixing the plant's violations and sold it back to Burns. Burns bought it back and rehired Homer the same day. Because Homer's employment was not a performance judgment, it was a contractual obligation. A piece of the deal that kept Abe silent about whatever Burns had done. Homer's job security was never about Homer. It was about his grandfather's silence and his mother's exile, and a decades-old arrangement between a complicit old man and the billionaire who had compromised him. And Homer, sitting in Sector 7G day after day, asleep at his workstation, dreaming whatever Homer dreams about, had no idea. 3 generations of Simpsons, each one damaged in a specific way by the same man's influence. Abe, compromised by a deal that required him to lie to his son about his wife's death, living with the knowledge that he purchased his grandson's job security by trading away his son's mother. The secret sitting in him for decades, fermenting, Mona, driven underground for 27 years. Her activism, her courage, her willingness to act against a billionaire's weapons program, punished with total loss. Her family, her home, her ability to watch her son grow up, all of it taken because she stopped to help someone fall and showed him her face. Homer, the wound without a source, the damage without a name, the man who cannot understand why his life feels heavy because everyone who could have explained it chose not to. His father lied to protect himself. His employer benefited from the lie. And Homer, who could have been brilliant if the crayon weren't in his head and the radiation weren't in his water, sat in the middle of it all and felt the weight without ever being given the map. Burns took Homer's mother from him when Homer was 6 years old. Not accidentally, not as collateral damage. As retaliation for Mona's raid on his weapons lab. He saw her face, reported her to the FBI, and then spent the following decades maintaining his pursuit of her with the personal investment of a man who takes his grudges seriously. And then he hired Mona's son, gave him a job and a salary and a reason to stay in the town where the contaminated water ran through the pipes and the cracked towers leaked their invisible damage, and he kept that son employed specifically because doing so was useful. Because Homer's incompetence was useful. Because a man too cognitively impaired to notice what the plant was doing to his family was the perfect man to sit in the room where the plant's safety was theoretically managed. Burns didn't just break Homer. He built the broken Homer he needed. There is a version of Homer Simpson who removes the crayon from his brain and emerges intelligent and articulate and capable of understanding the architecture of his own life. The show gives us this version. It is not a fantasy version. It is what Homer actually is when the obstruction in his brain is removed. He can read complex text quickly. He can identify causal relationships. He can write a comprehensive report on the plant's dangers that a federal agency takes seriously. He is, without the crayon, someone Burns would never have been able to keep employed at the plant. And Homer chooses to put the crayon back. He chooses stupidity. Not because he prefers it, because intelligence in Springfield was unbearable. Because when he could see clearly, he could see everything, including the gap between the life he was living and the life he should have had. And the gap was so large, so old, so much the product of forces that had operated on him since before he was old enough to resist them. That clarity didn't produce agency, it just produced grief. He chose the fog because the fog was the only thing that made Springfield livable. But the choice was rigged from the start. Homer was not meant to be intelligent in Springfield. Burns ensured this when Homer was 6 years old. On the morning his mother disappeared, every subsequent choice, the crayon staying in, the radiation staying in the water, the safety violations staying unaddressed, was just maintenance. Maintenance of a condition that Burns had created decades earlier and that served his interests too well to allow to change. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The episode is quiet and devastating in the specific way the best Simpsons episodes are devastating. Homer sits beside her bed. He holds her hand. He watches the woman he had 27 years of missed conversations with slip away for the last time. There are no jokes. There are no cutaway gags. There is no reset at the end. There is just a man and his mother and the weight of everything that was taken from both of them. The show is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath every joke, underneath every gag, underneath Homer falling down and getting back up and strangling Bart and eating a donut, there is this story. A family that was systematically dismantled by one man's power and one town's complicity across 3 generations, in ways that were visible if you knew where to look and invisible if you didn't. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal and buried the truth. Homer inherited the consequences and never understood why he felt the way he felt, and Burns won. Burns always wins in Springfield, because the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules were written a long time ago, in a deal made in the dark, in a lie told to a child about a grave that belonged to a poet. Homer Simpson will work at the power plant until he dies. Because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Let the weight of that settle slowly. Let it breathe in the quiet. We'll move forward gently to an episode that the show's fans have argued about for nearly 3 decades. An episode that is widely considered one of the worst the show ever produced, and which might actually be the most honest one. the one that showed you how Springfield works. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper, the 28th of September, 1997. This episode has been called The Moment the Simpsons Broke. The moment the writers stopped caring about continuity. The moment the show betrayed its audience's trust. It sits near the top of virtually every worst episode list the show's fan community has ever assembled. Harry Shearer, who voices both Principal Skinner and Mr. Burns among other characters, has publicly expressed his displeasure with the story. Critics who wrote about it at the time were not kind, and the fans have never entirely forgiven it. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event celebrating Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger arrives. A man nobody recognizes, introducing himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who had been captured as a prisoner of war and was believed dead. He survived his captivity. He escaped. He made his way home to Springfield. And he found that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner for 20 years is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, he was a petty criminal, a street kid from nowhere with no prospects and no identity worth protecting. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt a guilt that drove him to do something he understood even at the time was deeply wrong. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Skinner's mother, Agnes. When he arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or an identity that meant anything, made a decision. He went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the life, the mother, the career and education, the complicated relationship with an aging woman who was difficult to love and impossible to leave. He lived inside that borrowed identity for 20 years. He ran Springfield Elementary. He argued with Bart across a decade of mutual antagonism. He pined for a woman he could never quite commit to. He built a life out of someone else's name and wore it long enough that it started to feel like his own. Until the real Seymour Skinner walked through the door and the whole construction collapsed. Now here is what Springfield did with this information. The town held a meeting. The real Skinner was present. Tamzarian was present. The truth was fully exposed. Everyone in Springfield knew that their principal was a fraud. That the man who had been running their school and participating in their community for 2 decades was living a stolen identity. That the actual person whose identity had been stolen was standing in the room, alive, documented, real, and Springfield voted. Not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on whether to restore the real Skinner's identity or compensate him for the life that had been taken from him. They voted on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict was unanimous. They voted to maintain the lie. Judge Snyder issued a legal decree declaring the imposter to be the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the veteran, the man who had survived captivity and come home to find his life occupied by a stranger, was tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. The judge's decree made it explicitly illegal to ever again refer to the truth under penalty of torture. Not under penalty of a fine. Under penalty of torture. Fans hated this. The criticism was fierce and has never fully subsided. The argument was that the episode destroyed Skinner's character by revealing that everything audiences had known about him was built on fiction. His military service had belonged to someone else. His relationship with Agnes was a sustained deception. His entire personality, the neurotic but earnest principal, the man defined by his history, was constructed from borrowed material. And then the town voted to pretend none of it had been revealed. Critics called this bad writing, a failure of nerve, a willingness to reset a dramatic revelation for the sake of convenience rather than following the consequences wherever they led. But there's another way to read the episode entirely, an interpretation that makes it not the worst episode in the series, but the most revealing one. The Principal and the Pauper is not a failure of narrative courage. It is the most honest depiction of how Springfield actually functions that the show has ever produced. Springfield has been choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths since the very first episode. The town celebrated Jebediah Springfield as a founding hero after discovering he was a violent criminal who stole another man's identity to escape accountability in the East. The parallel with Tamzarian is exact and is not accidental. Springfield's founding myth is a lie told about a man who stole someone else's identity. Springfield's principle is a lie told about a man who stole someone else's identity. The town chose the lie the first time. It chose the lie the second time. The choice is not a mistake, it is a pattern. The difference in this episode is that you get to watch the mechanism explicitly. You see the vote. You see the decree. You see the physical expulsion of the person who insists on the truth. Every other time Springfield has chosen denial over reality, the choice has happened off-screen, between episodes, in the invisible reset that the audience accepts as episodic convention. In this episode, the show puts the machinery on stage. This is how Springfield forgets. Not through passive amnesia, not through some mysterious biological reset triggered by radiation or dream logic or cartoon convention, through an active, collective, deliberate decision, formalized in a legal document and enforced through the threat of violence, to declare a particular version of reality official and make all competing versions criminal. The real Seymour Skinner was expelled from Springfield not because he was dangerous, not because his presence was harmful, because his presence was inconvenient, because his existence was evidence that the official version of reality was wrong, and Springfield cannot afford evidence of that kind. Springfield's social contract depends on everyone agreeing not to present evidence of that kind. Apply this framework to the broader mysteries of the show, and it explains everything. Why does Springfield forget that the town was sealed under a glass dome by the federal EPA? Because remembering the dome means acknowledging the contamination, which means investigating the plant, which means confronting Burns, which means challenging the economic foundation of the town's only significant employer. The forgetting is not cognitive failure. It is pragmatic social survival. Why does Springfield reset after every catastrophe? Because the alternative is cumulative accountability, and cumulative accountability would eventually produce consequences that the town's power structure cannot survive. Springfield forgets deliberately. It forgets because forgetting is the only thing that makes the arrangement sustainable. Why does nobody in Springfield ever directly confront Burns about what his plant is doing to them? Because the last person who confronted Burns directly was Mona Simpson, and she spent 27 years as a fugitive for it. Springfield has had excellent object lessons in what happens to people who push too hard against the people who control the resources. The lesson has been absorbed. The real Seymour Skinner is a template. He is what happens when someone shows up in Springfield, carrying proof that the official narrative is wrong. The town's response to that proof is not gratitude or investigation or revision of the official record. The town's response is to tie the proof to a railroad car and send it away, and then to make it illegal to mention it. This is not unique to Springfield, and the show knows it. The episode works as satire because it describes something real. Communities, actual communities, not cartoon ones, have an extraordinary capacity for collective denial. Small towns in particular have perfected the art of the open secret, the thing that everyone knows and nobody discusses, the catastrophe that is processed once and then filed away in the category of things we don't think about. Springfield is an extreme version of a tendency that exists everywhere, and by making the mechanism visible, by giving the audience a scene where the town actually holds a vote to criminalize a truth, the show makes a statement that is more damning than any of the radiation violations or the coma evidence or the shooting conspiracy. It says, the forgetting is not accidental, the forgetting is a choice, and the choice has been made consistently, repeatedly, in ways that serve the interests of the people with the most to lose from the truth being remembered. The coma theory adds a layer that is almost too much to carry. If Homer is dreaming, if Springfield is the product of an unconscious mind, then the principal and the pauper is Homer's dreaming brain inventing a scenario where an entire community votes to sustain a lie. Why would Homer dream this? Because Homer needs to believe it's possible. He needs to believe that stolen identities can become real through collective agreement. He needs to believe that the fake version of a life can replace the true one indefinitely, as long as enough people agree to see it that way. Because Homer's coma is exactly that. A fake life replacing the real one. A dream maintaining itself through the collective agreement of every character inside it not to acknowledge what they actually are. The characters in Homer's dream vote, episode after episode, to keep the fiction running, to not ask the question that would end it, to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. And the town of Springfield, in The Principal and the Pauper, performs this act explicitly, in full view. On stage, in real time, with a judge's decree and an expelled truth-teller, and a town going home to sleep soundly in the knowledge that the official version has been preserved. Armin Tamzarian is still Principal Skinner. He has been, in the show's canon, for every episode since. Springfield decided, and the decision held, and the real Seymour Skinner, the last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal, is somewhere out there, tied to a train, moving away from the community whose name he was born with. The canary in the coal mine, expelled because he sang. Let Springfield's machinery of denial settle in the background like white noise. It's always running. It runs beneath every episode, beneath every joke and every reset, this gentle collective hum of agreed-upon fiction, comfortable, consistent, very quiet. We'll go to the final mystery now, the one that ties all the threads together, the floating timeline, and what it actually means that nobody in Springfield gets older. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Between those two dates, 36 years have passed in the world outside Springfield. Governments have risen and fallen. Technologies have been invented, integrated into daily life, and become obsolete. Generations have been born. Every cultural reference point that anchors a human life to a specific moment in time has shifted, sometimes multiple times, in the years since The Simpsons first aired. None of this has reached Springfield. Lisa is 8. She was 8 in 1989. Maggie is 1. Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s, give or take, in the permanent, flexible present of a show that has had to do quiet arithmetic with its own timeline more times than its writers would probably prefer. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters inhabit 2025. When an episode aired in 1994, the characters inhabited 1994. The year updates. The cultural references update. The technology updates. The characters don't. They exist in a state of permanent temporal suspension, living through decades of change while remaining entirely unchanged themselves. Most long-running animated shows use some version of this approach. It's practical, it's economically sensible. It prevents the show from becoming a period piece. Most viewers accept it without extended examination, understanding implicitly that it's a convention of the medium rather than a feature of the story. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has started producing contradictions that can no longer be waved away as convention. Homer and Marge's origin story is the most obvious example. When the show began, their history was grounded in the 1970s. They met in high school during a specific cultural era. Homer's shaggy pre-marriage hair was a 70s thing. Marge's prom dress was a 70s thing. Their early courtship was anchored to a moment in American cultural history that made sense for people who were in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. The nostalgia felt right, the references tracked. As the timeline floated forward, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s in 2005, they didn't meet in the 1970s, they met in the 1990s. If they're in their mid-30s in 2015, they met in the 2000s. The show has depicted their backstory in flashback episodes multiple times, and each iteration places their formative years in a different decade. They've been hippies, grunge fans, and hipsters. Their love story is the same love story each time, but the wallpaper behind it keeps changing. This means Homer and Marge don't have a history. They have an approximation, a placeholder backstory that is updated as needed to maintain the illusion of the permanent present. Their memories are not stable records of events that happened. Their memories are whatever the current episode requires them to have been. Which, in the context of every theory we've explored tonight, is one of the strangest features of Springfield's reality. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist in a frozen dream. Homer's brain locks Springfield in place on the day he lost consciousness. His children are the ages they were on the last day he saw them. His wife looks the way she looked in his last waking memory. The world outside the dream has been updating for 36 years. The dream has not, because dreams don't update. Dreams run on the reference material available at the moment of dreaming. If Homer went under in April of 1993, the Springfield in his mind is built from everything he knew and experienced up to April of 1993. The cultural references, the technology, the feel of the town, everything since is the brain's attempt to patch newer information onto an older framework, which is why later seasons feel increasingly disconnected from a coherent sense of time and place. The dream is running out of clean reference material and improvising. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the contamination has disrupted normal cellular processes at a fundamental enough level that biological aging no longer functions the way it should. The mutations that produced 4 fingers and yellow skin and unusual skull structures also interrupted the biological clock. Not stopped it exactly, but slowed it to a rate so gradual that 36 years of real time produces no observable change. The collective denial theory says nobody ages because Springfield has voted, formally and repeatedly, to ignore any evidence that the status quo has changed. Time passing is a form of change. Change requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is something Springfield has declared illegal when it threatens the agreed-upon version of reality. Springfield doesn't age because aging is a truth the town has decided to vote against. And Burns's immortality theory provides a fourth path. If one person in Springfield has found a mechanism for extending biological existence beyond its normal limits, then aging is not a fixed fact of this universe. It is a parameter that can be adjusted with sufficient resources and sufficient motivation. And if Burns can cheat death through medical infrastructure and extreme wealth, then the framework of Springfield's reality already includes the possibility that time's normal effects on living things are negotiable. All 4 theories arrive at the same conclusion by different routes. Time doesn't work in Springfield. Something has broken the normal flow of aging and consequence and change for everyone who lives there. The show has imagined its characters older. It's done it multiple times. In the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, the show flashes forward to a future where Lisa is 23, engaged to be married, living in London, and navigating the particular loneliness of being the kind of person who has always been too smart for her surroundings, but has never stopped hoping to find a place where that stops being true. The episode is one of the most emotionally resonant in the show's history. It depicts Lisa as an adult with a fullness and a specificity that suggests the writers knew exactly who she would become if time were allowed to operate normally. The episode ends, and Lisa goes back to being 8. The future closes. The window shuts. The permanent present resumes. The show can imagine its characters aging. It refuses to allow it. And the distinction between can and will is where the floating timeline reveals itself as something more than a production convenience. Because if the show's creators are capable of imagining and rendering a convincing version of who these characters would be as adults, the decision to keep them frozen is a choice. An active, deliberate, sustained choice made at every production meeting and in every episode Bible and in every decision about what the show is and what it will remain. Why would you make that choice? The simplest answer is commercial. The Simpsons is one of the most valuable intellectual properties in entertainment history. Keeping the characters at fixed ages keeps the franchise stable. It allows any episode to serve as an entry point for a new viewer. It prevents the brand from aging in ways that might limit its audience. Eternal childhood is a business strategy, but the more interesting answer is emotional, and it connects to something the floating timeline says about the relationship between audiences and the stories they love. The Simpsons are the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of television. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, cannot be allowed to change, because the version of the American family that The Simpsons represents is tied to a specific feeling, a feeling of home, of the family being whole, the children being young, the house being full of noise and chaos, and the particular warmth that comes from a life shared closely with people who frustrate and love you in equal measure. Homer must be the father who is still there to embarrass his children. Marge must be the mother whose patience has not yet reached its absolute limit. Bart must be the child who has not yet become the adult whose choices cannot be undone. Lisa must be the girl who is still fighting, still idealistic enough to believe that fighting matters. Maggie must be small enough to be held. The moment those things stop being true, the show becomes a different kind of story. And here is the part of the floating timeline theory that lands the hardest. The loop isn't their prison, it's ours. Audiences built it, audiences maintain it. Every time someone watches the show, every time someone quotes a line from an episode that aired before they were born, every time the couch gag plays and the family assembles on that orange sofa in exactly the configuration they've been assembling in since 1989, the loop tightens a little more. The demand for Springfield to remain Springfield, for the Simpson family to remain the Simpson family, is not imposed by the writers or the network or any particular commercial decision. It is generated by the people who watch, who return each week, who cannot let go of the version of home that Springfield represents. Because Springfield, for the people who grew up watching it, is not just a cartoon town, it is the version of childhood that television made stable, the family that never grew apart, the house that never fell silent, the dad who never died, the mom who never left, the kids who never stopped being kids. And as long as the show runs, as long as the timeline keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer stumbles through the door at 5:30 after another impossible day, that version of childhood stays accessible. You can go back to it. Any Sunday night, any rerun, the door is always open, the family is always there. It is, in its way, the same desire that the coma theory assigns to Homer. The dream that preserves the family in amber because the dreamer cannot bear to imagine them changed. Homer dreams Springfield because he cannot bear the alternative. The audience watches Springfield because they cannot bear the alternative. And the show runs and runs and runs because both of those needs are real and both of them are inexhaustible. The floating timeline is the mechanism that serves them both. Nobody ages in Springfield because nobody in Springfield is allowed to age. The characters cannot age without the audience's permission, and the audience has never given it. The show cannot end without the audience being ready to let it end, and the audience has spent 36 years not being ready, and so the loop continues. Bart is 10, Lisa is 8, Homer is home, Marge is in the kitchen, Maggie is in the crib, the cooling towers hum in the distance, the beer is cold, the sun, when Burns allows it, sets over a town that has no fixed location and no aging population, and no ability to remember what happened last week, because last week doesn't need to be remembered. Last week will happen again next Sunday. Everything resets. Everything returns. Springfield is waiting for you whenever you need it. That might be the most comforting thing about the show, when you understand what the floating timeline really is, and it might also be the saddest. Let the thought drift slowly. The town settling into its comfortable, impossible permanence. The family in the house on Evergreen Terrace, frozen at the perfect moment, waiting. We have a few more corners of Springfield to explore before we're done tonight. Let's go to the smaller mysteries next. The ones that don't require a grand theory to feel genuinely unsettling. The ones that have been sitting in the background of the show for decades, doing quiet damage. Not every mystery in Springfield requires a grand unified theory. Some of them are smaller, quieter, the kind of strangeness that sits in the margins of the show for decades before you suddenly see it and can't look away. Two of the most unsettling belong to characters who never receive the sustained analytical attention that Homer or Burns or the shooting mystery attract, Hans Moleman and Ned Flanders. Let's start with Moleman, because his particular variety of strangeness is the kind that accumulates slowly, and then, once you've counted it, becomes impossible to unsee. Hans Moleman is a small, elderly, nearly blind man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes. He has no consistent major role in the show's stories. He is not a character with a coherent arc or a meaningful relationship with the main cast. He exists in the margins, the background, the edge of the frame, and he dies there, not in dream sequences, not in Treehouse of Horror episodes where the show's normal rules are explicitly suspended. In regular canonical episodes, during the main storyline, in scenes that are presented as part of the show's actual reality, Hans Moleman dies. He is hit by cars. He is crushed by falling objects. He is buried alive. He is struck by lightning. He is incinerated. He is mauled by animals. He walks into traffic. He is hit by a baseball. He falls off things. The show kills Hans Moleman dozens of times. And then he appears in the next episode, unchanged, unaware, ready to be killed again. No explanation, no resurrection scene. No acknowledgement from any character that the small man who died last episode is inexplicably present again. He simply returns, the way background characters return, because the show needs bodies to populate Springfield, and Moleman is one of the bodies it uses. The running joke interpretation is the obvious one. and it's probably the intended one. Molman dies a lot. It's a recurring sight gag. The show doesn't think about it too hard, and neither should you. But Hans Mollemann once told someone his age. He stated it directly, as a fact about himself that he had no particular reason to misrepresent. He said he was 31 years old. Look at Hans Mollemann. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s at minimum. The skin, the posture, the diminished size, the failing eyesight, the general impression of a body that has been running for a very long time and is not happy about continuing. If Molman is telling the truth about being 31, something has aged him catastrophically. Something has compressed what should be 6 more decades of adult life into a body that looks like it has been running since before the current century. And then consider that this catastrophically pre-aged 31-year-old also dies repeatedly and comes back each time. The radiation theory has a specific and pointed answer for this combination of features. Molman represents the extreme end of Springfield's contamination effects. The mutations that produced 4 fingers and yellow skin and aberrant skull shapes in most residents produced something more fundamental in Molman: accelerated aging, first. The contamination worked on his biology with a speed and severity that compressed decades of cellular deterioration into a much shorter timeline. And then something else, something that makes death in Molman's case a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. A cellular reconstruction capacity that allows his body to reconstitute itself after fatal trauma in ways that normal biology cannot support. Homer survives injuries through the coma theory's dreamlike logic or through the radiation theory's enhanced healing capacity. Molman actually dies and comes back. His biology has been so thoroughly rearranged by the contamination that the normal biological finality of fatal injury no longer applies to him. Springfield has a man who is 31 years old and looks 90, and who dies and comes back, and nobody in the town thinks this warrants investigation. Not the police, not the medical community, not a single curious neighbor. Hans Mollemann falls under a steamroller, and a week later he's standing in line at the Quickie Mart and nobody comments. The collective denial theory would note that Springfield has simply agreed not to see this. Not because the residents are incapable of seeing it, because seeing it would require them to ask questions about what kind of place produces a 31-year-old man who looks 90 and dies repeatedly. And that question leads, as all questions in Springfield eventually lead, back to the cooling towers humming at the edge of town. Under the coma theory, Molman is a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character in a narrative that doesn't give him enough attention to maintain his consistency between cycles. Homer's unconscious mind deploys Molman when the scene needs him, has him die because that's the action associated with Molman in Homer's memory of the character, and then reassembles him for the next scene, without registering the contradiction. Molman isn't a person in this reading. He's a recurring narrative element that Homer's dreaming brain can't quite keep consistent. His 31-year-old age disclosure is either the dream's attempt to give a background character a specific detail to make him feel more real, or it's one of those moments where the dream's internal logic surfaces unexpectedly and reveals something true about the Springfield it's constructed. Maybe Molman really is 31 in Homer's memory of him. Maybe the dream preserved him at 31 from the last waking reference Homer had, even as the dream aged him visually beyond his years. Either way, he keeps dying, and he keeps coming back, and Springfield keeps not noticing, which is, in its small, quiet way, one of the stranger things this show has been doing for 30 years. Now, Ned Flanders. Ned is the character the show has quietly destroyed more thoroughly than any other, and the darkness hiding behind his relentless cheerfulness is one of the most genuinely disturbing subtexts in the entire series. On the surface, Ned is everything Homer is not. He is kind and patient and generous. He is devoutly religious and genuinely committed to that devotion. He is physically fit. He is financially responsible. He is a good father to Rod and Todd, a good neighbor to the Simpsons, a good member of the community. By any objective metric, Ned Flanders is a better person than Homer Simpson in virtually every measurable way, and the show punishes him for it relentlessly. His wife, Maude, was killed at the Springfield Speedway when Homer dodged t-shirts being fired from a t-shirt cannon, and the shirts struck Maude instead, knocking her from the bleachers. Homer's reflexive self-preservation, his instinct to avoid the shirts aimed at the crowd, directly caused the death of Ned's wife. Homer's selfishness killed Maud Flanders. Ned forgave him, because that's what Ned does. He forgives. He absorbs punishment after punishment and responds with patience and grace and the quiet, unwavering faith that God has a plan. He turns the other cheek. He takes the extra step. He maintains his cheerful demeanor through losses that would break most people, and he credits his faith with the ability to sustain him through them. And then a hurricane destroys Ned's house. The community rallies to rebuild it. The community does this with such spectacular incompetence that the rebuilt house collapses immediately. And Ned, standing in front of the ruins of his home, in the aftermath of a loss compounded by a second humiliation, snaps. He has a complete psychological breakdown. He screams at the town. He says things he's been holding inside for years, possibly for his entire life. Things that don't sound like Ned Flanders. Things that sound like the person underneath the Ned Flanders performance. The person the performance has been containing and redirecting for as long as he can remember, and then he's institutionalized. In the psychiatric facility, it's revealed that Ned's relentless niceness is not a character trait. It's the product of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was, as a young child, extremely difficult, violent, uncontrollable. His parents, being enthusiastic adherents of permissive philosophy, did not believe in discipline and did not impose any. Ned ran wild for years. Then they took him to a psychiatrist who, over years of intensive intervention, essentially conditioned the aggression out of him through behavioral programming. Ned's kindness was trained into him. His patience was engineered. His inability to express anger is not spiritual mastery of the self. It's a psychological cage that a doctor built around a feral child to make him functional in social environments. Everything about Ned's personality is not who Ned is. It's who Ned was made to be. This is the episode where the show cracks open the nicest character in Springfield and shows you what's underneath. And what's underneath is a man who cannot feel his own anger, who cannot recognize his own resentment, who has been so thoroughly programmed to convert negative emotional states into positive ones that the conversion happens automatically before Ned ever gets to feel the original emotion. His patience with Homer isn't virtue, it's pathology. When Homer does something harmful, when Homer's negligence or selfishness causes Ned genuine damage, Ned's internal response goes through a process that was built into him in childhood. The anger arises, the mechanism engages, the anger is converted into something more acceptable, and Ned responds with forgiveness. Not because he chose to forgive, because his brain was programmed to produce forgiveness as the automatic output for anger inputs. He was conditioned to be this way before he was old enough to have opinions about what kind of person he wanted to be. His faith, from this angle, is not just spiritual conviction. It is the framework that gives the conditioning its narrative coherence. If everything that happens to Ned is part of God's plan, then everything that happens to Ned is acceptable. The conditioning doesn't have to fight against resentment because the faith system absorbs the resentment before it can accumulate. God has a plan for the hurricane. God has a plan for Maud's death. God has a plan for the neighbor who will never appreciate what Ned does for him. God has a plan. Except the show has established, across multiple episodes, that God is real within its universe. God has spoken to Homer. God has had direct personal conversations with Homer, given him advice, responded to his prayers with specific interventions. Homer's relationship with God is personal and ongoing. Homer, who sleeps through church, who treats faith as optional, who has committed every sin available to a cartoon character, has direct access to the divine. Ned, who goes to church every Sunday. Ned, who prays with genuine devotion and means every word. Ned, who has built his entire life around the framework of his faith and who applies that framework consistently and earnestly and without the ironic distance that most characters bring to religious conviction. Ned has never heard from God, not once. Not in a dream, not in a sign, not in any of the moments where his faith was being tested most severely. Homer talks to God and gets answers. Ned lives for God and gets silence. That's not random. That's a thesis statement. The Simpsons is telling you something specific about the relationship between goodness and reward in the universe it depicts. The show is saying that goodness is not what determines who gets divine attention. Homer gets divine attention not because he deserves it, but because the narrative needs him to have it. Ned does everything the faith asks and receives nothing from it except the psychological comfort of the framework itself. In Springfield, the system doesn't reward righteousness, it rewards centrality. Homer is central, Burns is central, Maggie is significant, Ned is peripheral. And the peripheral characters in Springfield, no matter how virtuous, no matter how much they give and forgive and endure, remain peripheral. The system is not designed to elevate them. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything correctly in a system that wasn't designed to acknowledge correctness. He is the most thorough demonstration the show has ever produced of the gap between what Springfield promises its residents and what it actually delivers. Homer does everything wrong and survives everything. Ned does everything right and loses everything that matters to him. They live next door to each other. They have been next door to each other for 36 years. And the gap between them has never closed, because the gap is not a result of their choices. It's a feature of the system they both inhabit. A system that was designed, from its foundations, to keep certain people comfortable and certain people grateful, and to make both groups believe that the arrangement reflects something about their own merit, rather than something about the architecture of power in a town owned by a billionaire who hasn't let anyone look too closely at his cooling. Towers in 36 years. Ned Flanders is the saddest character in Springfield. He is the proof of the town's fundamental unfairness, made visible in a man who can't see it himself because his brain won't let him. And every Sunday he waves at Homer across the fence and smiles and says something cheerful and means it, because he was programmed to mean it, and the programming has never failed, and Ned has never once been given the option to decide whether he wanted to be this way or not. That's Springfield's quietest cruelty. Let it settle softly. Let the neighborhood be still. The lights on in both houses, the Simpson house loud and chaotic, the Flanders house tidy and muted, and the gap between them holding steady, as it has always held, as it will always hold, as long as the town keeps running. We're coming to the end now, the final thread, the one that ties everything together. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We've walked the contaminated streets and drank the radioactive water and felt the invisible weight of decades of unaddressed exposure. We've sat with Homer in his hospital bed and wondered if he ever really woke up, if the show has been a love letter from an unconscious father to a frozen family for 30 years. We've reopened the Burns shooting case and felt the discomfort of a mystery that was officially closed before the evidence was fully examined. We've traced Burns's impossible lifespan and found it rooted in the very substance he's been leaking into the community he owns. We've watched Maggie watch everything from behind her pacifier and understood that the silence is not empty. We've looked at the predictions and found that satire, when it's accurate and sustained long enough, starts to feel like prophecy. We've followed Mona Simpson's trail from a Springfield kitchen to a federal fugitive list and traced the damage her absence left across 3 generations of her family. We've watched Springfield vote to criminalize truth and exile the man who carried it. We've counted the things nobody in this town gets older and sat with the reason why. Every theory we've explored has followed a different path. The radiation theory moves through biology and environmental contamination. The coma theory moves through psychology and dream logic. The denial theory moves through sociology and collective behavior. The immortality theory moves through economics and medical dependency. The prediction phenomenon moves through culture and confirmation bias. But every path leads to the same address. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental. Something that has been wrong from the beginning and has been quietly documented in the margins of a comedy show for 36 years, while the audience laughed at the jokes and the town kept forgetting what it knew. The show has been showing you what's wrong for its entire run, not through dramatic revelations designed to force the audience's attention, through accumulation, through the patient, relentless layering of detail upon detail upon detail until the picture is undeniable to anyone who looks at it fully. The 3-eyed fish, the yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the cracked cooling towers, the 742 employee errors that never resulted in termination. The coma that lasted 7 weeks and cost 5% of a brain, the mother who disappeared in the night and was replaced with a dead poet's headstone, the principal who is not who he says he is and was never prosecuted for it, the baby who shot a man and was never charged for it, the 31-year-old who looks 90 and dies every few weeks and comes back each time, the billionaire who glows in the dark on Tuesdays and has been alive since before the invention of the automobile. None of this is laziness. None of this is accidental. None of this is the background noise of a show that has been running so long it stopped paying attention. It's the show paying very close attention to a very specific set of ideas and distributing those ideas across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes in a way that requires sustained engagement to fully assemble. The Simpsons is not hiding its mysteries. It is showing them to you, every episode, in plain sight. The yellow faces, the impossible survival, the collective forgetting, the billionaire's glow. It's all there. It has always been there. But nobody in Springfield can see it. And the theories we've spent tonight exploring all arrive at the same explanation for why. Whether it's radiation damage or dream logic or collective denial or the particular variety of comfortable numbness that comes from living inside a system that has been running long enough to feel like nature, the residents of Springfield have lost the capacity to see what they're looking at. Lisa sees it. Lisa has always seen it. Lisa is 8 years old, and she has been fighting the same fight for 36 years, raising her hand in the classroom and being ignored, writing the report and watching it go unread, caring about the three-eyed fish when everyone else has moved on. She is the one character in Springfield who has never stopped looking, never stopped asking, never accepted the comfortable version over the true one. And Lisa exhausts herself. Because seeing clearly in a place that has organized itself around not seeing clearly is the loneliest kind of work there is. The show keeps Lisa 8 years old because 8 is the age where that kind of seeing is still possible, where the socialization that eventually teaches children to accept the official version of reality hasn't quite finished its work, where the gap between what a child can see and what adults are willing to acknowledge is at its widest. If Lisa grew up, if the timeline were allowed to move forward, she might learn to stop fighting. She might develop the particular exhaustion that eventually teaches intelligent, principled people that the system is more durable than their resistance to it. She might become like Mona Simpson, fighting hard and losing everything, or like Abe Simpson, making a deal in the dark and living with it, or like Homer, choosing the fog because the alternative is unbearable. Keeping Lisa 8 keeps her fighting, keeps her hand raised, keeps her asking the question that nobody wants to answer. Why are we all like this? The show will never answer that question directly. That's not where the answer lives. The answer lives in the accumulated evidence of 36 seasons. In the contaminated water and the coma dream, and the baby's silence, and the principal's stolen name, and the billionaire's weekly treatments, and the old man who dies and comes back, the answer lives in the pattern, assembled from hundreds of individual pieces across decades of storytelling. The show will not tell you what Springfield is. It will only show you, again and again and again, the details that add up to what Springfield is and wait for you to do the assembling. Some people never do. They watch the jokes and laugh and come back next week for more jokes. That's a valid relationship with the show. Maybe it's the most sustainable one, but some people start pulling at the threads. Some people notice the fish and look at the plant and look at the residents and look at the guest characters and start counting fingers. Some people hear Homer lose 5% of his brain and don't let it go. Some people watch a town vote to exile truth and recognize the mechanism from somewhere real. Some people look at the baby in the room, checking her surroundings before she moves her pacifier, and understand that they've been shown something they weren't supposed to notice. Those are the people the theories belong to. The people who couldn't accept the surface, who needed to know what was underneath, who looked at Springfield and refused to believe it was just a cartoon town with funny people and a funny dad. It's not just that. It was never just that. Springfield is a contamination zone pretending to be a town, a dream pretending to be a life, a collective fiction maintained through social contract and legal decree, and the systematic expulsion of anyone who insists on a different version. A closed-loop economic system powered by the biological damage of the population it exploits. A place where time has stopped because time moving forward is too costly to allow. And it is also, genuinely, the most beloved fictional community in American television history. A place that millions of people think of as home. A place that has been waiting every Sunday night for 36 years for people who needed somewhere to belong. A place where the beer is cold and the family is whole and the children are always young and nobody has to say goodbye. Both of those things are true at the same time. The darkness and the warmth, the contamination and the comedy, the prison and the paradise. That's Springfield, that's always been Springfield, and that's why we can't leave. Whether you've been listening closely or whether you've been drifting in and out of sleep, Whether Springfield feels like a mystery to you or a home or both things at once, you know more about this town now than you did when we started. You know where the yellow skin comes from. You know why Homer can't connect the dots. You know who Maggie is watching and what she might be waiting for. You know why nobody ages. You know what Burns is actually paying for with his weekly treatments. You know what the vote in The Principal and the Pauper was really about. You know that Springfield is a place where truth gets tied to a railroad car. And you know that the show has been telling you all of this, episode by episode, week by week, joke by joke, for 36 years. The theories don't ruin The Simpsons. They make it richer. They reveal a show that is operating on more levels than its surface requires, that is interested in questions it never directly poses, that has embedded a sustained examination of power and contamination and collective denial inside 36 years of jokes about a fat man who loves donuts. The fat man loves his family. That's the part the show never hides. Underneath everything, underneath the radiation and the coma, and the conspiracy and the silence, Homer loves his family with a completeness that his damaged brain can barely express but never stops generating. That's the loop. That's why it keeps running. Homer stumbles through the door and the family is there. Bart is still his boy. Lisa is still his daughter who is too smart and still loves him anyway. Maggie is still the baby who is small enough to hold. Marge is still there, still patient, still the foundation the whole fragile structure stands on. Every week, every episode, every time the couch gag plays and the family piles onto that orange sofa, home. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. That's the whole point. And on that note, let the town go quiet around you. Let the cooling towers hum at a comfortable distance. Let the lights go low on Evergreen Terrace. Let Bart stay 10 and Lisa stay 8 and Maggie stay small and Homer find his way home one more time. Rest now. Springfield isn't going anywhere. It never does. 1. Springfield, the town that shouldn't exist, to 4,000 words. 2. The nuclear mutation theory, to 4,500 words. 3. Homer's comb, to 4,500 words. 4. Who really shot Mr. Burns, to 4,500 words. 5. Mr. Burns and the Immortality Machine, to 4,500 words. 6. Maggie Simpson, the silence that thinks, to 4,000 words. 7. The Simpsons predictions, to 4,000 words. 8. Mona Simpson and the conspiracy, to 4,500 words. 9. The Principal and the Pauper, to 4,000 words. 10. The Floating Timeline, to 4,500 words. 11. Bonus theories, Hans Moleman and Ned Flanders, to 4,000 words. 12. The final thread, to 3,500 words. Pacing is deliberate and slow throughout. Allow pauses at section breaks. Section endings are written as natural breathing points. The CTA, comment location and time, subscribe, appears after section 1. No screaming or high-energy moments. This is designed as sleep content. Long sentences are written to flow into each other at a storytelling pace. Italics, emphasis are left unmarked. Voice actor should find natural stress section of the script to meet the 40,000-plus word target. There's something specific about the way The Simpsons opens every episode that is worth paying attention to. The camera descends through clouds, moving over a town that is revealed gradually, piece by piece. The power plant first, always the power plant. The towers rising from the landscape before anything else is visible. The school, the church, the downtown district, the suburban streets. Each element of Springfield introduced in sequence, as if the camera is remembering the place rather than discovering it. And then the family, scattered across town during the day, converging on the house in the evening, Homer leaving the plant, Lisa leaving the school, Bart leaving wherever Bart has been, Marge in the car, Maggie on foot somehow, impossibly walking home from the supermarket. They arrive at the house from different directions and pile onto the couch together. The family assembled, the family whole, the day completed. Every episode begins with that convergence. Every episode reminds you that the family is the center of Springfield, that the town exists to frame the family, that the power plant and the school and the church and the Quickie Mart and all the other landmarks are the context in which the Simpsons live rather than places with their own independent existence. This is the first thing the show wants you to believe about Springfield, that it is a setting, background, scenery. The theories we'll explore suggest something different. They suggest that Springfield is not the background of the show, that it is the subject of the show, that the Simpson family is not the story, but rather the most visible symptom of the story the show has actually been telling since 1989. Consider the way Springfield's history accumulates. Not through consistent, coherent world building of the kind that fantasy or science fiction series typically pursue, where a fictional universe is constructed with deliberate internal consistency and defended against contradiction. Springfield's history accumulates the way real history accumulates, messily, with contradictions that are never quite resolved. With official versions of events that diverge from the evidence those events left behind, with figures who are more complex than their civic reputations suggest, and civic reputations that were built on foundations that nobody examined too closely, the town was founded. The town has a founder. The founder, Jebediah Springfield, has a monument in the town square, has an annual celebration in his honor, and has an origin story that the town treats as the bedrock of its identity. He was a brave pioneer. He tamed a wild land. He was the kind of man who could wrestle a bear and pin it. Lisa discovered the truth about Jebediah Springfield. The evidence is documented, recoverable, available to anyone who looks for it in the right archives. Jebediah Springfield was not who the town thought he was. He was a violent criminal, a fraudster who had escaped accountability for serious crimes by taking a new identity and heading west. The bear wrestling story was invented. The brave pioneer mythology was constructed after the fact by a community that needed a founding myth and selected the nearest available candidate without asking too many questions about his actual biography. Lisa brought this evidence forward. She presented it. She offered the town a chance to update its understanding of its own history, and then she decided not to. At the last moment, watching the faces of people who needed Jebediah to be real, who needed the myth to be true, who had built their civic identity on a story that made them feel like they came from somewhere significant, Lisa chose silence. She kept what she'd found. She let the myth stand. She made a pragmatic calculation about the relative value of truth versus the cost its revelation would impose on people who hadn't asked to have their foundations disrupted. It was an act of compassion. It was also the first time the show made explicit something it would return to many times. Springfield is a town that keeps its myths because the myths are load-bearing. Pull them out and the structure shifts. Every long-standing community has some version of this. The comfortable founding story that survives investigation only by not being investigated. The local hero whose reputation doesn't benefit from close scrutiny. The tradition whose origins have been politely forgotten because the origins are inconvenient. Springfield is not unique in having myths that serve functions independent of their truth. It is unusual only in how many of them there are, and how much the town needs them, and how sharply the show depicts the mechanisms by which they are maintained. The nuclear plant is the most important myth of all. The myth that it is simply infrastructure. That it is a normal industrial facility in a normal American town, providing a normal public service. That the man who owns it is a normal, if eccentric, employer. That the man who manages its safety is doing a normal, if imperfect, job. These myths are load-bearing in the most literal sense. Remove them and Springfield as a functioning community collapses. The economic foundation fails. The employment infrastructure dissolves. The power supply ends. And then the questions that couldn't be asked while the plant was operating would have to be asked, and the answers would cascade in ways that nobody in Springfield's power structure wants to contemplate. So the myth stands. The plant is just the plant. Homer is just Homer. Burns is just an employer. And from that foundation, more myths can grow. The founding father who was actually a criminal. The principal who was actually an imposter. The shooting that was actually not what the official record says it was. The town that forgets its catastrophes because it has been practicing forgetting since before most of its residents were born. Springfield is a place whose entire existence depends on not being examined too closely, and the show, which has been examining it closely for 36 years, keeps leaving the evidence in the open. In the fish, in the skin color, in the bones in the basement of the plant, in the billionaire who glows on Tuesday evenings, In the baby who checked her surroundings before she reenacted a shooting in an empty room, the evidence is there. It has always been there. Springfield just needs you to look. The other thing worth establishing before we go deeper into the theories is the specific quality of time in Springfield. Not the aging question, which we'll address fully later, but the texture of time. The way it feels to exist in Springfield's present tense. Visitors to Springfield often remark on it within the show's own narrative. There's something unusual about the town. Something that's hard to name, but that makes itself felt in the way events flow into each other without accumulating weight. A disaster happens and the town responds, and then the disaster is gone. Not forgotten exactly, not suppressed, just released, set down. The next thing arrives and the previous thing is no longer present. This is how trauma works on a community that has processed the same kind of trauma so many times that the processing has become automatic. The mechanism kicks in, the community handles the immediate crisis. And then the mechanism does its other job, the less visible job, the job of releasing the crisis from active memory so that the community can function without carrying the cumulative weight of every previous crisis it has survived. Springfield has survived a lot. The dome, the environmental disasters, the multiple near misses at the plant, the political scandals, the civic frauds, the violent crimes, the economic collapses. Any one of these events in a real community would leave a mark, would reshape how the community understands its situation and what it does about it. Springfield absorbs them and releases them and returns to baseline, not because it is uniquely resilient, because it has developed, through decades of necessity, a very efficient system for not letting things stick. The theories offer different explanations for this system. The radiation theory says the population's neurological damage makes sustained integration of distressing information genuinely difficult. The coma theory says the dream resets between cycles because that's what dreams do. The denial theory says the reset is a social choice. The floating timeline says it's a production convention. All of them are pointing at the same observable behavior. Springfield forgets. It has been forgetting since the beginning. It will be forgetting long after the last viewer has fallen asleep. And there is something almost peaceful about that, when you stop trying to assign it a cause and just observe it as a feature of the place. A town that cannot accumulate its own weight. A community that processes loss and catastrophe and injustice and then releases them into the air like steam from the plant's cooling towers, rising and dispersing, leaving no visible trace. It's only when you're standing downwind of the plant that you realize the steam isn't actually gone. It just can't be seen anymore. There's a specific moment in the show's early seasons that the mutation theory uses as a reference point, and it's worth sitting with at length before we move on. Burns is forced, after the three-eyed fish controversy, to eat Blinky on live television. He does this in front of cameras, in front of reporters, in front of a town that has been watching nervously to see whether their employer will be held accountable for the state of the water he's been poisoning. Burns eats the fish, he swallows it, he smiles. He says something dismissive about environmental alarmism, and the crowd, watching, decides that this is satisfactory. A billionaire ate a three-eyed fish, and therefore the fish is fine, and therefore the water is fine, and therefore everything is fine? This is the sequence of logic that Springfield applied to a mutation that should have triggered an emergency investigation. The fish was caught in the river near the plant. The fish has an extra eye. Someone powerful said the fish is harmless. The town accepted this and moved on. No one tested the water. No independent laboratory was brought in. No environmental agency was contacted. No residents organized to demand an investigation. The three-eyed fish became, within the show's running mythology, a sort of civic mascot, a symbol of Springfield's quirky identity rather than an alarm about its biological reality. This is the pattern the mutation theory asks you to examine. Not just that the evidence exists, but that the evidence exists in plain sight and has been absorbed into the town's identity rather than into its understanding of its own danger. Springfield knows about Blinky. Springfield has a Blinky. Springfield sells Blinky merchandise. The three-eyed fish went from emergency evidence of contamination to local character in the space of a single electoral cycle, and nobody tracked the moment it made that transition or asked what it meant that the transition had happened at all. This is what the contamination is doing to the town's relationship with evidence. Evidence arrives. The evidence is alarming. The mechanism engages. The evidence is reframed. The reframed version is absorbed. The original alarm is released, and the fish still has 3 eyes. The fish will always have 3 eyes. Let's think about the cumulative biology for a moment, because the mutation theory isn't just about physical changes, it's about functional ones. About what decades of low-level radiation exposure does to the specific cognitive systems that would otherwise allow a population to protect itself. There is well-documented research on the neurological effects of radiation exposure in human populations. It is not a subject the scientific community invented for the purpose of entertaining Simpsons fan theories. The connections between certain kinds of environmental contamination and reduced neurological function, including specifically the functions associated with planning, sustained attention, cause and effect reasoning, and the integration of new information with existing beliefs, are real and have been studied for decades in populations living near industrial contamination sites. Springfield's specific profile, the remarkable incuriosity, the inability to connect obviously related pieces of information, the extraordinary capacity for forgetting distressing events, the compliance with authority that persists even when authority is clearly acting against the community's interests, maps onto that research in ways that are uncomfortable to examine directly. The show did not invent this mapping. The show observed it. The writers of The Simpsons have been watching a pattern of behavior in American communities for decades and reflecting it back in the form of a cartoon town. The specific behaviors of Springfield's population are not invented. They are extrapolated, caricatured, concentrated, but drawn from real tendencies that appear in real communities that have been subjected to real economic and environmental pressures over real decades. The mutation theory takes the extrapolation seriously and asks, what if the show is being literal about the mechanism? What if Springfield's yellow skin and 4 fingers and remarkable cognitive compliance are the show's way of illustrating, in a form that is visible and cartoonishly impossible to miss, what environmental contamination and economic dependency actually do to a population over multiple generations? The answer to that question is not comfortable. But it's the answer that the evidence consistently points toward. Now consider the physical resilience. Homer Simpson has survived things that should have killed him many times over. The show plays this for comedy, but the pattern is consistent enough across hundreds of episodes that it amounts to a canonical characteristic. Homer is effectively indestructible by conventional means. He heals rapidly, recovers completely, and displays no lasting physical effects from injuries that would be permanently disabling or fatal for a normal person. This is usually explained by cartoon logic. Characters in animated shows don't carry consequences from episode to episode. The resilience is a production convenience, but the mutation theory offers a different explanation, and it connects the resilience to the same source as the other mutations. The same cellular alterations that produced 4 fingers and yellow skin and unusual skull structure also enhanced certain biological repair mechanisms. The contamination changed the rules of Homer's biology in multiple directions simultaneously. It reduced his cognitive function, it altered his physical appearance, and it enhanced his capacity for physical recovery beyond anything that normal human biology can support. Homer is not invulnerable. He gets hurt, he feels pain, he bleeds, he loses consciousness. He flatlines, but his body reconstructs itself from these states with a speed and completeness that implies a cellular regeneration capacity that has been, somehow, supercharged. The same radiation that is slowly killing the fish and the rats and presumably the unexamined residents of Springfield who don't get weekly maintenance treatments from private physicians has, in Homer specifically, produced a set of mutations that include a dramatically enhanced healing rate alongside dramatically reduced cognitive function, which raises a question the show doesn't answer directly. Is this unique to Homer? Are other Springfield residents displaying similar enhanced resilience? Is Molman's repeated survival of fatal events the same phenomenon at a more extreme level? Is the general population of Springfield harder to kill than it should be, in ways that the show depicts obliquely but never explicitly names? The mutation theory says yes. The contamination has changed the biological rules for everyone who lives in Springfield, in ways that vary by individual but that collectively define what it means to be a body in this particular environment. You're harder to kill. You're harder to age. You're harder to change. And your brain, the part of you that would otherwise process the reality of your situation and respond to it with appropriate alarm, is the part that has been most thoroughly compromised. Burns engineered this system, not with a precise blueprint, not with a deliberate scientific plan for producing cognitively compromised but physically resilient workers in his community. But he maintained the conditions that produced it. He kept Homer employed. He refused to fix the violations. He kept the water contaminated. He kept the air contaminated. He kept the cracked cooling towers cracked. And he watched his town adapt to its poison in the way that living things adapt to chronic stress. Not by healing from it, by incorporating it, by becoming something different from what they were before it arrived. Springfield has incorporated its contamination. The yellow skin and the four fingers and Homer's ridiculous resilience, and the collective amnesia and the fish with three eyes are all the same story. All the same adaptation to the same poison by a population that never had the option of a different response. The story the plant is telling, told in biology, across 3 generations, visible to anyone who is willing to look at it directly instead of calling it art style and moving on. Let's think about the internal experience of a coma press of a photo, because the theory becomes much more interesting when you actually sit inside its premise, rather than treating it as an external framework to apply to the show from outside. If Homer went under in April of 1993, and his unconscious mind began generating a sustained simulation of his life, what would that simulation draw on? It would draw on everything Homer knew up to that moment. His memory of Springfield, his understanding of his family, his feelings about his job, his neighbors, his social world, the ambient data coming into his senses from the hospital room around him. Voices, the television in the corner, conversations between nurses and family members. Whatever Marge said to him on the day he went under, on the days after, on the days she sat beside him holding his hand and waiting, Homer's unconscious mind is not generating this simulation from nothing. It's working with material. It's building Springfield from the only Springfield it has direct access to, which is the one that existed in Homer's memory and experience on the day of the coma, supplemented by whatever fragments of the outside world penetrate the fog of unconsciousness and get absorbed into the dream. This explains the celebrity appearances. In the years since Homer went under, the culture outside his hospital room kept generating content. Television shows aired, famous names were mentioned. Voices became culturally prominent. Homer's unconscious mind, receiving ambient data from a hospital television or from conversations around his bed, would absorb these fragments and integrate them into the dream. A name heard through the fog becomes a character in the simulation. A voice on a television becomes a face in Springfield. The influx of celebrity guests that begins in the middle seasons and accelerates over time is the dream getting more of its source material from the outside world rather than from Homer's memories. His memories are getting thinner. The direct memory of Springfield as it existed before the coma is getting more worn, more abstract, less detailed. The dream supplements it with fragments from the external world that pass through the hospital room and into the fog. This is also why the later seasons feel progressively more disconnected from a coherent sense of physical reality. In the early seasons, the dream draws heavily on Homer's actual memories of actual Springfield. The physics feel more grounded. The stories feel more emotionally connected to recognizable human experience. As those memories become more worn and the dream draws more on ambient fragments, the simulation becomes less grounded, more dreamlike, in the standard sense of the word, less bound by cause and effect, less interested in consequence. Homer's memory of Springfield is a finite resource. 30 years of dreaming has depleted it in ways that 30 years of actual living wouldn't have, because actual living replenishes memory with new experience, while dreaming only consumes the memory that was already there. The later seasons of The Simpsons feel different from the early seasons. The consensus among fans and critics is almost universal on this point. Something changed. The show that produced Homer, the Heretic, and Marge vs. The Monorail and Last Exit to Springfield is not quite the same show that produced the later seasons. The change is real and widely acknowledged. What is disputed is the cause. The coma theory says the cause is neurological. Homer's dreaming brain is running out of the raw material it needs to generate a coherent, emotionally resonant simulation. The dreams get stranger because the dreamer is getting weaker. The plots get more surreal because the underlying memory structures that gave the early simulation its texture and consistency are thinning under the sustained pressure of 30 years of unconscious processing. The show doesn't decline because the writers get worse. The The show shifts because the dreamer's brain changes over time, and the shift is consistent with what we know about the trajectory of a long-term coma. The brain does not maintain stasis. It continues to change. The function that is available at the beginning of a coma is not the same function that is available a decade in. The dream changes as the dreamer changes. There is another piece of this theory that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The theory asks why, if Homer is dreaming, the dream is so specifically about family. Why does every episode, regardless of how surreal the plot becomes, ultimately resolve around Homer's relationship with Marge, with Bart, with Lisa, with Maggie? Why does the dream keep returning to that house on Evergreen Terrace? Why does Homer always find his way home? Because the dream is doing the work that dreams have always done for the people they belong to. It is processing what matters most. It is returning again and again to the thing that the dreamer most needs to hold on to. Homer's deepest fear is not running out of donuts. It's not losing his job. It's not even dying. Homer's deepest fear, revealed across hundreds of episodes through the enormous emotional response he has to any threat to his family's stability, is losing the people he loves, being alone, being left. The dream gives him the opposite of that fear. It gives him his people, whole and present and unchanged, available to him every day, incapable of growing up and growing away. The dream is not a nightmare. It is the fulfillment of his deepest wish dressed up as a situation comedy. And when Homer's situation gets dire within the dream, when Marge threatens to leave or Bart is in danger or Lisa is hurt, the dream always pulls back from the edge, always finds a way to restore the family to wholeness before the episode ends, because the dreaming mind that is generating the simulation cannot afford to resolve its central wish in the negative direction, cannot afford to generate a permanent version of the thing it most fears. The dream lets Homer approach the loss of his family. Then it pulls him back, every time. Because if the family breaks, if Marge leaves for good or Bart is gone or the house on Evergreen Terrace is empty, there is nothing left for the dream to be about. And if the dream ends, Homer has to wake up. And waking up is the thing the dream was built to prevent. Homer's coma is the most loving thing his unconscious mind could have made. A world where the family is always there. A world where he always comes home. A world where the children are always young and the marriage is always salvageable. And the door at 742 Evergreen Terrace is always unlocked and the lights are always on. Some people dream about flying. Homer dreams about dinner at the kitchen table. About Bart's mischief and Lisa's saxophone and Marge's worried voice calling everyone in from wherever they've scattered. About Maggie in the crib at the top of the stairs making her sounds. It's the most ordinary dream imaginable. And it's the most extraordinary act of love the show has ever depicted. The summer of 1995 deserves its own context because the cultural moment in which the Burns shooting mystery landed matters to understanding how it functioned. This was before social media, before Reddit and Twitter and the kind of networked, real-time collective analysis that would, 20 years later, allow a fan community to assemble a comprehensive theory within hours of an episode airing. The tools for collective investigation in 1995 were early internet message boards, telephone conversations, water cooler discussions, and newspaper television columns. The information moved slowly by current standards. The analysis was fragmented, and yet the mystery generated more coordinated discussion than almost any fictional event in television history up to that point. People genuinely organized around it. Fan groups coordinated. Television critics treated it as a legitimate puzzle rather than a promotional gimmick. The cross-media tie-in with America's Most Wanted suggested that someone at Fox understood that the mystery had tapped into something real about the audience's desire to participate in a story rather than just watch it. The contest was the formalization of that desire. The show was not just inviting you to watch. It was inviting you to solve, to be part of the story, to bring your analytical skills to bear on a problem that the show had constructed specifically to challenge those skills. And then the answer was revealed and, essentially, nobody had gotten it right. This outcome has been discussed mostly in terms of the show's misdirection skills. The red herrings were too effective, the genuine clues were too subtle, the mystery was harder than advertised. All of these are reasonable conclusions. But there's a darker possibility that the contest outcome raises and that the show's relationship with its own mystery seems to endorse. What if the answer wasn't derivable from the clues, because the clues didn't reliably lead to the answer? The show told the audience that the mystery was solvable from the information presented in Part 1. Al Jean and the other producers said this publicly and repeatedly in the lead-up to the resolution. The clues are there. Watch carefully. And then when the answer was revealed, no one in a large random sample of entrants had gotten it right using those clues. One person, posting on a news group on the night the cliffhanger aired, got it right. Their methodology is unknown. They may have deduced it from the clues. They may have guessed. They may have had access to information about the production that wasn't publicly available. What the show's own creators described on the DVD commentary is that the answer was somewhat reverse-engineered, that the writers had considered multiple potential shooters over the course of the writing process. That Barney Gumble was a serious candidate at one point, for reasons entirely separate from the physical evidence, that the Smithers ending was animated to completion and held as a real option. If the writers were genuinely considering multiple answers even as they were assembling the first episode, then the clues in Part 1 were not laid specifically to point toward Maggie. They were laid to create a mystery, which is a different goal. Clues designed to create a mystery generate suspicion widely and confirm nothing specifically. They are designed to make everyone seem guilty rather than to lead a careful investigator to one person. A mystery designed to be solvable distributes its clues differently. It makes some details more significant than others. It ensures that the correct answer, when revealed, produces a retrospective recognition. The clues were there. I should have seen it. Instead, the Burns mystery produced mostly the opposite reaction. The clues were there, but they didn't lead where the show said they led. The revelation felt arbitrary rather than inevitable, which is what happens when the answer is chosen after the clues rather than before them. The show essentially confirmed this on the commentary. The mystery was partially reverse-engineered, and a reverse-engineered mystery is, by definition, a mystery whose official resolution may not be the most consistent conclusion from the available evidence. Maggie was chosen, among other reasons, because no jury in the world would convict a baby. The show itself states this. Choosing Maggie produced an answer that closed the case without producing any ongoing narrative consequence. It was a tidy resolution to an untidy situation. But tidy is not the same as true. And the fact that Homer confesses in a later episode, on screen, in dialogue that the show included in a canonical episode, and then simply allowed to sit without follow-up, is a piece of information that the show's production team chose to include. The writers put Homer's confession in the script. The producers approved it. The actors recorded it. The editors left it in. Someone decided that Homer should say, in the canon of the show, that he shot Burns. And then the show moved on without examining the confession. This could be a continuity error. The show has plenty of continuity errors, but it could also be the show acknowledging, in the only way it can acknowledge something without officially acknowledging it, that the official record and the truth are two different things. That somewhere in the gap between Maggie's identification and Homer's casual confession and Burns's unexplained casualness about his attacker's identity, the actual story of what happened in that parking lot is still waiting. The case was closed. The file exists. Maggie is listed as the official party responsible. Chief Wiggum signed off on it. But closed cases can be wrong. Springfield has demonstrated this more than once. The official version of Jebediah Springfield was wrong. The official identity of Principal Skinner was wrong. The official resolution of the Burns shooting may be wrong. Springfield just made it illegal to say so. Let the case sit there in the archives. Officially resolved, unofficially haunted. The evidence that doesn't quite add up, preserved in the record of an investigation that everyone agreed to stop pursuing. That's Springfield. That's how justice works in a town where the mechanisms of accountability are themselves part of the system they're supposed to check. The truth is in there somewhere. Mixed in with the official record, the convenient conclusions, the evidence that pointed the right way for the wrong reasons, it's waiting for someone who is still willing to look. There is something about the way Burns moves through his own wealth that tells you everything about how he understands time. He is not in a hurry. He has never been in a hurry. His schemes operate on timelines that presuppose decades of sustained effort because Burns has decades to give them. While other characters in Springfield make plans measured in weeks or months, Burns operates in years and generations. He purchased the town's power infrastructure not as a short-term investment, but as a long-term control mechanism. He maintained his pursuit of Mona Simpson not for months but for nearly 3 decades. He has held grudges and maintained strategies across spans of time that would see most people through an entire career and into retirement. Burns doesn't think about retirement. Burns thinks about continuation. There is a specific kind of thinking that very old, very wealthy people develop. Not smarter than ordinary thinking necessarily, but slower and more patient, more willing to wait for the right conditions. More accustomed to the idea that the current situation is one phase in a longer process rather than an event in itself. Burns operates this way because Burns has had the time to develop this way of thinking across a century of experience. He was not always what he is now. The show gives you glimpses of a younger Burns, a Burns who existed before the weekly treatments and the disease equilibrium and the near total atrophying of his physical capacity. He was recognizably human once. He had relationships with people who were not purely functional. He had something resembling ordinary ambition rather than the vast, impersonal appetite for power that characterizes him in the show's present. What changed him? The obvious answer is time. The long exposure to the processes that now sustain him. The century of proximity to radiation in its various forms. The slow replacement of normal human biological processes with the artificial maintenance regime that now constitutes his biology. But there may be more to it than simple biological drift. The show suggests, through the history of the Burns family, that Charles Montgomery Burns is the product of a specific kind of wealth that does specific things to the people who inherit it across multiple generations. The kind of wealth that is old enough to have established its own logic of survival. The kind of wealth that teaches its heirs, generation after generation, that continuation is the primary value and that everything else, sentiment, relationship, ethics, ordinary human attachment, is subordinate to the goal of keeping the fortune intact and the dynasty running. Burns didn't become cold. He was trained to be cold. He was trained to understand the world in terms of resources and leverage and the long-term maintenance of power. The emotional atrophying that makes him seem monstrous is not a personal failing. It is the outcome of a very specific kind of education applied over a very long time. And the radiation regime is the physical equivalent of that education. It is the maintenance of the structure at the expense of everything organic. Burns's body is being kept running the way an ancient institution keeps itself running. Not through health, but through the careful management of the systems that would otherwise produce decline. Not through vitality, but through the artificial prevention of the deterioration that vitality would normally forestall. He is a man who has traded every natural process for a managed one. He no longer ages naturally. He no longer heals naturally. He no longer maintains his disease-riddled body through any mechanism that occurs without deliberate intervention. He is, in the most literal sense of the word, sustained. Held in place. Kept going by the machinery of his own wealth, because stopping is not something the machinery allows. The question of whether Burns experiences this as a good thing, whether the continuation he has engineered for himself is something he values in the way that ordinary people value the continuation of their lives, is one the show circles without quite landing on. He does not seem happy. He does not seem to take pleasure in the things that sustain him in the way that a person who wanted to live would take pleasure in the things that kept them alive. His treatments produce a temporary euphoric state, the glowing walk through the woods, that looks from the outside like pleasure but operates more like the aftermath of a powerful medical intervention than like the satisfaction of a person who is glad to be alive. Burns continues. He does not flourish. The distinction matters because it suggests that the immortality machine he has built is not delivering what a living person would understand as life. It is delivering continuation, which is something different. Continuation without growth, extension without development. The same Burns, in the same configuration, sustained indefinitely by the same weekly intervention. A Sisyphean arrangement, in its way. Not the boulder rolling up and coming back down. The boulder suspended at the top, held in place by the effort required to hold it, never descending and never arriving anywhere. That might be the darkest thing the show implies about Burns. Not that he is monstrous, not that he is corrupt, but that his immortality, the thing he has organized his entire existence around maintaining, is not actually a life. It is a maintenance contract. And the contract has been running so long that the person who signed it can no longer remember what he signed it in exchange for. There is a specific episode where Maggie saves Homer's life, and the way she does it is worth examining slowly. Homer is in danger. The danger is real within the logic of the episode, and Maggie, watching from wherever Maggie watches, assesses the situation and intervenes. The intervention is physically unlikely for a 1-year-old. The actions required exceed what a baby's motor development should support. The planning involved in the intervention exceeds what infant cognition should be capable of. Maggie does it anyway, and Homer is saved. And then the episode moves on, and the family doesn't examine what just happened in any depth, because the Simpsons family, as a unit, has a very consistent relationship with Maggie's capabilities. They love her, they celebrate her, and they don't fully process the evidence she keeps providing about what she actually is. This is the loop Maggie lives in, she demonstrates. The family doesn't integrate the demonstration into their understanding of her. She returns to baseline presentation, the pacifier, the wide eyes, the helpless effect, and then she demonstrates again when the situation requires it. Some version of this happens in almost every episode where Maggie is a meaningful participant in the plot. She acts. The action is too sophisticated for an infant. The family responds warmly without updating their model of who Maggie is, and Maggie returns to the silence. The theory asks whether this loop is coincidental or whether Maggie is maintaining it deliberately, whether the family's failure to integrate the evidence is a result of their general cognitive limitations, or whether Maggie is actively managing their perceptions, whether the pacifier is a prop in a performance, that Maggie is directing herself. Look at the moments when Maggie does reveal herself, when she acts overtly rather than subtly. These moments are almost always moments where the stakes are high enough that action is required, regardless of the risk of being noticed. When the family is in genuine danger, Maggie acts and allows herself to be observed acting. When the stakes are lower, when the situation could be resolved through the normal chaos of the family dynamic without Maggie's intervention, she stays invisible. That's not random. That's prioritization. That's a decision-making framework that weighs the value of remaining unnoticed against the urgency of a particular situation. A baby doesn't have a decision-making framework. A baby has reactions. Maggie has a framework. The silence extends to her relationships with characters outside the immediate family. Maggie interacts with Burns in the context of the shooting. She interacts with other infants in the daycare context. She interacts with the family dog and the family cat. In all of these interactions, she presents as a baby, as the helpless, passive, dependent creature that infants are supposed to be, except when she checks to make sure nobody is watching first. That detail is the detail the theory keeps returning to. The checking. The deliberate assessment of the environment before acting or revealing. The awareness that being observed changes what actions are available. Maggie knows that her capabilities are surprising, and that surprising people creates responses that complicate things. So she manages the surprise. She controls when it happens and under what conditions. That's not infant behavior. That's strategic behavior. It is the behavior of someone who has thought carefully about the relationship between being seen and being safe, and has concluded that visibility is a resource to be managed rather than a condition to be accepted. Maggie is the most strategically sophisticated member of the Simpson family. She has been from the beginning. And the show has been telling you this in every episode where she acts, since she was introduced as a prop that Marge was buying back at the grocery store in the very first episode. She is not a prop. She has never been a prop. She is the Simpson who is paying attention. The specific mechanism by which The Simpsons has shaped cultural expectations deserves more examination than it usually receives in discussions of the prediction phenomenon, because it explains something that pure coincidence and pure trend extrapolation together don't quite account for. When the show made its Trump as president joke in 2000, it was making that joke to an audience of tens of millions of people. The joke circulated in cultural memory for 16 years before the election, not loudly, not prominently. But the image of a Trump presidency as an absurdist punchline existed in the cultural bloodstream, accessible to anyone who had seen the episode or read about it or heard it referenced in conversation. Cultural memory shapes expectations in ways that are difficult to trace, but real. A joke that circulates widely enough becomes a frame. It becomes a way of seeing a situation. When the situation that the joke anticipated arrives, people don't encounter it fresh. They encounter it pre-framed. They already have a narrative structure for it. They already have an emotional response to it. They've already processed it as absurdism and moved on. This prior processing changes how the arrival of the actual situation feels. The shock is attenuated. The novelty is reduced. The event feels familiar in a way that is hard to explain without reference to the prior cultural processing. And the familiarity is then retroactively attributed to the show. The show knew. The show predicted it. What actually happened is that the show gave 20 million people a pre-established frame for a future event, and when the event arrived, the frame activated and produced a sense of recognition that got interpreted as prophecy. This is not a trivial process. It's not just a cognitive quirk, it has real effects on how events are received and processed. A political development that arrives completely without cultural preparation is processed differently than one that arrives after a cultural touchstone has already made it feel familiar. The familiarity reduces anxiety. It creates the impression of an event that was somehow inevitable rather than contingent. It makes the event feel like the completion of a narrative rather than the eruption of chaos. The Simpsons has been doing this work for 36 years, making things familiar before they happen, giving the audience a frame before they need it, preparing the cultural imagination for futures that haven't arrived yet by depicting those futures as jokes. The jokes normalize the futures they describe, and normalized futures arrive with less resistance than unnormalized ones. Whether this is what the writers intended is largely irrelevant. The effect is real regardless of intent. The show's cultural reach and its longevity together produce a mechanism for cultural preparation that functions independently of any conscious prediction. The writers don't need to be seers. They need only to be good observers writing for a sufficiently large and long-running audience. There's a version of this mechanism that is more unsettling than the others, and it's the one that connects most directly to Springfield itself. Springfield is a description of America's civic dysfunctions made visible and literal. The corrupt billionaire who owns the essential infrastructure, the incompetent government that cannot hold him accountable, the captured regulatory agency that exists to manage the appearance of oversight rather than the reality of it, the population too economically precarious and too cognitively exhausted by the demands of survival to organize effective resistance, the media that covers the surface events without examining the structures that produce them. These are satirical observations. They were satirical observations in 1989. The question that the prediction phenomenon raises, and that the show itself never quite asks directly, is whether they are still satirical in 2025 or whether they have become descriptive. Whether the cartoon has become the documentary. The Simpsons started as a mirror held up to American dysfunction. Over 36 years, the reflection and the thing being reflected have moved closer together. Springfield has become more realistic not because the show changed, but because the country changed. The gap between the satirical exaggeration and the observable reality has narrowed in ways that make the earlier episodes feel almost nostalgic in their distance from the present. The things the show was making fun of for being too extreme in 1989 are closer to ordinary in 2025. That's the most important prediction the show has ever made. Not Trump or smartwatches or space tourism. The prediction that American civic dysfunction would deepen over time rather than self-correct. That the forces the show depicted as absurd would consolidate rather than disperse. That Springfield would start to feel like a description rather than a caricature. So far, the prediction appears to be accurate. The episode Mother Simpson is careful about something that a lot of the show's best episodes are careful about. It takes its comedy seriously. It doesn't treat the emotional revelation at the center of the episode as something that needs to be quickly covered by a joke. It lets the reunion between Homer and Mona breathe. It lets the weight of 27 years of absence be felt. It doesn't rush past it. And in doing so, it gives the audience something that the show's comedy-first approach usually forecloses. The time to understand what this information means. The time to sit with the specific quality of Homer's grief, which is not the clean, well-defined grief of someone who lost a parent they knew, but the more complicated grief of someone who lost the relationship they should have had but never actually experienced. Homer didn't know his mother. He knew a story about his mother. He knew the story Abe told him, the story of a woman who had died young and been buried in a grave that turned out to belong to a 19th century American poet. He constructed a version of himself around that story. The boy whose mother died. The man who grew up without her. The person who carries that specific shape of loss. And then the story turned out to be false. and Mona turned out to be real. And the man Homer could have been, the man he would have been if his mother had been present, became briefly visible through the window of their reunion and then closed again as Mona fled Springfield for the second time and Homer's life returned to its established shape. The reunion that should have happened didn't happen, not fully. Not in the way that might have made a real difference to the architecture of who Homer is. They got an afternoon, a few hours. And then the machinery that had kept them apart for 27 years engaged again and Mona was gone. The show depicts Homer watching her go. He doesn't chase the car. He doesn't try to stop her. He understands that stopping her would put her in more danger, that Burns's reach in Springfield is too long for Mona to be safe anywhere within it. Homer lets her go. And in the letting go, something about his expression suggests that he is also letting go of the version of himself that the reunion had briefly made possible. The man who might have been different. The man who might have been whole. Homer goes back to the house. He goes back to Marge and the kids and the job and the couch. He goes back to being Homer Simpson of Sector 7G, the man who eats donuts and falls asleep at his workstation and can't always remember his boss's name. But something is different after Mother Simpson. Something has shifted in how the show understands Homer's relationship to his own situation, because now we know why the situation has the shape it does. We know whose decision it was that Homer grow up believing his mother was dead. We know whose vindictiveness produced the specific wound that the entire architecture of Homer's personality was built around. We know that the broken man Burns employs was broken by Burns. The conspiracy isn't abstract after Mother Simpson. It's personal. It has specific people and specific choices, and a specific chain of cause and effect that runs from a parking lot in 1969, where Mona stopped to help someone who then saw her face, to a kitchen in Springfield in the perpetual present, where Homer sits on his couch and watches television and doesn't connect the dots between the man who pays him and the man who took his mother. The conspiracy connects everyone. Mona's activism targeted Burns's weapons lab. Burns's retaliation targeted Mona's family. Abe's deal with Burns protected Homer's employment at the cost of Abe's integrity and Homer's truth. Homer's employment at the plant, guaranteed by Abe's silence, ensures that the safety violations continue, that the contamination continues, that the cognitive damage continues, that Homer remains incapable of connecting the dots that would reveal the full shape of what has been done to him. The crayon in Homer's brain is the symbol of all of it. A foreign object that reduces his capacity for critical thought. An object that was there for his entire life without anyone in Springfield's medical system noticing or choosing to remove it. An object that, once removed, allowed Homer to understand his world clearly enough to write a damning report about the plant. An object that Homer then chose to have reinserted because understanding his world clearly was too painful to sustain. The whole system, from Burns's original retaliation against Mona, to Homer's daily sleepiness at his workstation, to the leaking coolant in the cracked towers, is held together by that crayon and what it represents. The deliberate, sustained suppression of Homer's capacity to understand what is being done to him. Whether the crayon was placed deliberately by someone working with Burns's interests in mind, or whether it arrived accidentally and was simply never removed because the Springfield medical establishment is compromised, the effect is identical. Homer is kept small. Homer is kept compliant, Homer is kept at the plant, and Burns, who knows everything about radiation and its effects on biological systems because he manages his own radiation exposure with clinical precision, knows exactly what the plant is doing to Homer. He sees the consequences of the contamination in Homer every day. He employs that consequence. He relies on it. The man who destroyed Homer's family also employs Homer's destruction. He looks at Homer across the desk in the rare moments when Burns remembers Homer exists, and he sees the outcome of everything the plant has been doing to Springfield for decades. He sees it, and he finds it useful. That's the conspiracy at its center. Not just the contamination, not just the deal, not just the exile of Mona or the lie about the grave. The deliberate choice, made repeatedly and maintained systematically, to look at the damage and call it appropriate. Burns has always known. The show makes this explicit across multiple episodes. He knows what the plant is doing. He knows what it did to Homer's mother, and to Homer, and to everyone in Springfield who drinks the water. He knows, and he has decided that the knowing doesn't obligate him to anything. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules don't require the man with the money to care about the damage his money creates. Mona fought that logic. She fought it in 1969. She paid for fighting it with 27 years of exile, and she died knowing that the fight had changed nothing fundamental about the system she had attacked. Homer inherited the consequences. He will work at the plant until he dies, because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, and because Burns is still there, still getting his weekly treatments. Still glowing faintly on Tuesday evenings. Still not remembering Homer's name. Still winning. The Principal and the Pauper makes a specific claim about how communities work, and it makes it without hedging. The claim is this: a community's collective preference for comfort will consistently defeat an individual's claim to truth, and the community will use whatever tools are available to enforce this preference. Legal tools when available, social tools when legal tools are insufficient, and if neither is sufficient, the simple physical removal of the truth-teller from the community itself. This is not a particularly radical claim about how communities work. Sociologists, anthropologists, and historians have documented the mechanism in real communities across cultures and across time. The small town that covers up the local scandal. The institution that protects its reputation over its members. The family that agrees, collectively, to not discuss the thing that happened. The community that experiences a historical injustice and decides, after a generation or two, that it would be more comfortable to have not experienced it. The Principal and the Pauper takes this mechanism and renders it literally, with a legal decree and a railroad car and an explicit vote. It makes the mechanics of collective denial visible in a way that real communities manage to keep invisible. Real communities don't vote out loud on whether to acknowledge the truth. They arrive at the same outcome through 1,000 individual decisions not to bring it up, not to pursue it, not to insist. Springfield votes out loud. That's what makes the episode feel wrong to so many viewers. It makes explicit what should remain implicit. It brings the machinery into the light, and the machinery, once visible, is very hard to unsee in every other episode of the show. Watch any episode of The Simpsons after watching The Principal and the Pauper, and you will see the vote happening. Not explicitly, not with a judge and a decree, but functionally. A catastrophe occurs. The community processes it, and then the community votes, through the accumulated weight of its collective attention and inattention, to not continue carrying it. The catastrophe is released. The baseline is restored. The vote passes unanimously and silently and is never recorded but holds anyway. Springfield runs on a perpetual, unofficial vote to maintain the status quo. The Principal and the Pauper made the vote official. That's why it felt like a betrayal. Not because the vote was new, because seeing it was. Consider what Armin Tamzarian actually represents in the context of the show's larger concerns. He is a man who built a better life on a stolen foundation. He took an identity that belonged to someone else, and he used that identity to become someone valuable to his community. He ran the school. He was a known quantity. He had relationships, however fraught, with people who depended on him. He was, by the metrics that matter for a functioning community, more useful as the fake Skinner than the real one. And the real Skinner, the man whose identity was stolen, was a stranger. He had been gone for 20 years. His relationships with the community had been severed by his absence. He had the legitimate claim, but not the functional integration. He was right, but he was useless to a town that had learned to work around his absence. Springfield's choice to keep Tamzarian is not irrational, from a purely pragmatic perspective. It's cold and it's wrong, but it's not irrational. The community weighed the disruption of truth against the stability of fiction and chose stability. Societies make this calculation routinely and usually choose stability. Springfield made it out loud and got criticized for it. The real Seymour Skinner is the cost of that choice. He is what gets discarded when comfort wins over truth. He goes out on the train and takes his legitimate claim with him, and Springfield returns to normal, and the judge's decree ensures that nobody has to think about it. That's the architecture of denial, not the dramatic suppression of truth. The quiet, practical, democratic choice to find the truth inconvenient and act accordingly. Springfield has been making this choice since the beginning. The Jebediah Springfield revelation, the three-eyed fish, the Burns shooting, the repeated environmental catastrophes, the flooding, the dome, the sinkhole, the tire fire, the luminous rats, all of it processed and released. All of it voted away. The real Seymour Skinner stands at the end of that history. The accumulated cost of the accumulated votes. One honest man, expelled from the community that needed him least and deserved him most. The last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. And he's somewhere out there, on the tracks, moving away from Springfield, and the town has already forgotten that he was ever there. There is a thought experiment worth running about the floating timeline that the theory of collective denial makes most interesting. Imagine you could sit down with any Springfield resident, anyone except Lisa, who maintains her own troubled relationship with the show's apparent cognitive norms, and ask them how old Bart Simpson is. They would say 10. Ask them how old Bart was 20 years ago. They would pause. And then, in the way that Springfield residents pause when confronted with questions that the unofficial social contract discourages, they would say 10. Ask them to account for the discrepancy. And here is where the experiment gets interesting, because the possible responses fall into specific categories, and each category maps onto one of the theories we've been exploring. The radiation-compromised resident would simply fail to register the discrepancy as a discrepancy. The cognitive function that would normally flag the contradiction, compare the two statements, and identify them as logically incompatible, would not activate. The information would arrive and would not produce the expected response. The resident would say 10 and 20 years ago 10 and not experience any friction between those answers. The coma dream resident doesn't exist outside Homer's dream and cannot therefore be asked anything. But within the dream, the resident would provide whatever answer the dream required. If the dream needs Bart to be 10, the dream resident would say 10. The dream doesn't permit contradictions to surface because contradictions threaten the simulation. The denial theory resident would register the discrepancy, would feel the friction of the incompatible statements, and would then, through the mechanism that Springfield has perfected, release the friction rather than pursue it. Would shrug, in the specific way that Springfield residents shrug, the shrug that means we don't go further than this, and would move on. And the floating timeline resident, if such a thing exists, would not be a resident of Springfield in the literal sense, but rather a viewer of a show about Springfield, and would understand that the question doesn't apply. The floating timeline is a production choice that viewers are implicitly asked to accept. It is not a question the show's universe is equipped to answer. Except that the coma theory and the denial theory together suggest that the show's universe has answers for all of these questions. They're just not the answers the show is designed to provide. The deeper question the floating timeline raises is about what we want from the stories we love. Not what we get, but what we want. And the floating timeline is a direct response to something that viewers communicate to the shows they watch through their continued engagement with them. Don't let them grow up. Don't let things change. Keep the family together in the house with the lights on. Keep it the way it was when we first loved it. This is not a uniquely Simpsons-related desire. Every show that runs long enough eventually encounters a version of this pressure. The characters that audiences have attached to cannot be allowed to change too dramatically, cannot be allowed to age past a certain point, cannot be allowed to develop in ways that make them unrecognizable. The audience's love for the character is love for a specific configuration of that character, frozen at the moment of attachment. The floating timeline is the mechanism by which the show honors that desire. It says, "We will not let them age. We will not let them change. The family will be preserved in the configuration you fell in love with for as long as we can manage to sustain it." And the show has sustained it for 36 years. There is something in that which is both generous and slightly alarming. Generous because it honors the real emotional attachment that audiences have developed. Alarming because it does so by refusing to tell the truth about time. By making a fundamental lie, nobody ages, the premise of the entire enterprise. The characters are frozen, the family is preserved, but you are not. Every viewer who was a child watching The Simpsons in 1990 is now an adult. The children who watched Homer and Bart bond over a shared experience are in their 40s. The teenagers who quoted Bart's catchphrases are raising children of their own. The world has changed, the viewers have changed, and Springfield has not. And this creates a particular kind of experience that becomes more pronounced the longer the show runs. The experience of returning to something that is exactly as you left it while you have been somewhere else entirely. The experience of a home that is more stable than you are. A family that is more constant than yours. Homer is still there. Marge is still patient. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still fighting. Maggie is still waiting. You go back to them and they are exactly as you remembered, which is simultaneously comforting and, if you think about it long enough, deeply strange. Because the thing that comforts you most about their permanence is also the thing that makes their situation, from inside the story, most terrible. They cannot change. They cannot grow. They are trapped in amber at the moment you most needed them to be exactly as they are. The trap is the comfort. The comfort is the trap. And the show has been sustaining this arrangement for 36 years because the viewers need it and the viewers will not give it up and the show will not take it from them. That's the floating timeline. That's what it's actually doing. Not a production convenience. A social contract between a show and its audience. A promise made in 1989 and kept, episode by episode, week by week, for 36 years and counting. We will not let them go. We will not let them age. We will keep the lights on in that house on Evergreen Terrace and the family assembled on that orange couch for as long as you need them there. And you will need them there for a long time. You always do. Let's stay with Ned Flanders a little longer, because his situation deserves more than a summary. The specific cruelty of Ned's life in Springfield is not that he suffers. Lots of people in Springfield suffer. Homer suffers. Marge suffers in her patient, quietly enduring way. Even Burns, in whatever attenuated form the word experience applies to a man whose emotional range has been narrowed by a century of self-interested calculation, seems at some level to suffer the loneliness of someone who has outlived everyone who ever knew him as a human being rather than an institution. The cruelty of Ned's life is the gap between what he is and what he receives in return for being it. Ned is, by the show's own accounting, one of the most virtuous people in Springfield. He gives, he forgives, he helps. He maintains his faith and his community presence and his generosity under conditions that would erode most people's commitment to those things. He does all of this not because it generates rewards. It doesn't. He does it because he is constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. The conditioning, the childhood behavioral modification that replaced his anger with patience and his resentment with forgiveness. The cage that was built around his personality before he was old enough to choose whether he wanted to live in a cage. Ned cannot be cruel. He cannot sustain resentment. He cannot, despite the weight of everything he has been given genuine reason to resent, hold on to the anger that would be a natural and justified response to the specific sequence of losses and humiliations his life has produced. He was programmed not to. The psychiatrist who worked with young Ned was responding to a genuine crisis. A child who couldn't be controlled was a child who couldn't function in social environments, and the programming was presumably intended to give him access to a life that his uncontrolled self would have made impossible. The intention was benevolent, but benevolent intentions can produce terrible outcomes. The outcome here is a man who cannot protect himself emotionally, who cannot set limits, who cannot feel and act on the full range of emotions that serve as a human being's navigational system for moving through a world that contains other people who will sometimes harm you. Ned has no navigational system. He has a programming that converts harm into forgiveness automatically, before the harm can register long enough to produce protective responses. He is, as a result, perpetually available for harm in a way that normal people are not. Homer can hurt Ned as many times as Homer's particular combination of thoughtlessness and selfishness produces opportunities to hurt him, and Ned will absorb each instance and produce forgiveness as reliably as an appliance produces heat. This makes Ned a saint in the show's mythology. And saints, as a category, are interesting precisely because they are people for whom the normal human capacity for self-protection has been replaced by something that is admirable from the outside and incomprehensible from the inside. Ned doesn't experience his forgiveness as a spiritual achievement. He doesn't choose to forgive Homer. The forgiveness happens before the choice can be made. It's downstream of the moment when choice would have been possible. By the time Ned is conscious of having been hurt, the mechanism has already processed the hurt into something that doesn't require an active response. He's not a saint. He's a person who was modified, without consent, to produce saintly outputs. The difference matters. And the show has been depicting this distinction with increasing clarity since the episode where Ned's breakdown revealed the conditioning behind the niceness. It has been showing you a man who does everything right in a system that doesn't reward rightness, and whose inability to feel or act on the normal human response to being unrewarded is not virtue but machinery. The machinery holds. It held through Maud's death. It held through the hurricane and the incompetent reconstruction. It held through Homer's 1,000 thoughtless moments of the kind that accumulate into a lifetime of low-grade harm. It held through God's consistent silence in the face of Ned's consistent prayer. It holds because it was built to hold. Because the psychiatrist did good work. Because the cage is well constructed. And somewhere inside the cage, behind the beehive hairdo and the neighborly wave and the cheerful okily dockily that has become the most famous speech tick in the show's vocabulary, there is the person who existed before the cage was built. That person has never met Homer, has never watched Maud fall, has never stood in front of a collapsed house and found the resources to be gracious about it, has never prayed and received silence and kept praying. That person would have responded differently to all of it. We'll never know how. The show will never show us. Because the cage held, and the person inside it has been in there for long enough that the cage is all Springfield knows. That's Ned Flanders, the most thoroughly confined person in a town full of people who are confined in different ways. Confined by radiation damage, by dream logic, by collective denial, by contractual obligation, by the machinery of wealth. And Ned is confined by kindness, engineered kindness. The kind that smiles and waves across the fence and means every word of it and cannot stop. The lights are on in both houses on Evergreen Terrace tonight. One is full of noise and chaos, and the particular warmth of a family that loves each other badly but sincerely. The other is quiet and tidy and lit by a faith that has never been answered. And the fence between them holds them both in place, and everything is fine, and Springfield is exactly as it always was, and nothing needs to change, and the loop continues, gentle and steady and unending. Just like the show. There's a way of watching the show that most people who grew up with it never quite articulate, but that shapes the experience profoundly. It's the experience of watching something that knows you as well as you know it. Not personally. Not in the way that a friend knows you. In the way that a story knows its audience when the story has been watching its audience long enough. The Simpsons has been watching its audience for 36 years. It has observed the way Americans live and work and worry and hope and forget and try again. It has built Springfield from those observations. It has populated Springfield with characters assembled from those observations. And it has told, across nearly 800 episodes, a story about a family that is in every important sense the audience's family. Made of the same materials, shaped by the same forces, living with the same combination of joy and failure and resilience and mess. The theories we've explored tonight are ways of taking the show seriously, ways of saying that the accumulation of detail across 36 years is too consistent to be accidental, too specific to be laziness, too precisely calibrated to be anything other than intention. The radiation theory, the coma dream, the Burns conspiracy, the architecture of denial, Maggie's silence, the floating timeline, all of them are saying the same thing in different languages about a show that has been saying it across hundreds of episodes. Something is happening in Springfield. Something that the town cannot face and the audience cannot quite name, but that is legible in the accumulated evidence if you're willing to look at it steadily. The something is power. The way power operates in a community. The way it shapes biology and memory and law and love. The way it maintains itself by ensuring that the people most harmed by it are the people least equipped to challenge it. The way it rewards complicity and punishes resistance and structures the available choices so that the only realistic options are variations on compliance. Burns is not a cartoon villain. He is a cartoon rendering of a structural reality. The fact that he cackles and wrings his hands and occasionally confuses a paperweight with plutonium doesn't change what he represents. He represents the concentration of economic power in a single private actor, operating without effective oversight over a community that has become entirely dependent on his continued operation and therefore entirely unable to hold him accountable. Homer is not a cartoon idiot. He is a cartoon rendering of what happens to the people at the bottom of that power structure over time. Cognitively diminished by the environment, emotionally damaged by a specific personal history that was produced by the same forces that damage everyone else, employed in a role that requires his failure because his success would threaten the structure that employs him. Marge is not a cartoon long-suffering wife. She is what makes the structure survivable, the one who holds everything together through patience that should not be sustainable, and love that should not survive the conditions it operates under. The foundation that the whole fragile edifice stands on. Lisa is not a cartoon precocious child. She is what remains of the critical impulse in a community that has trained itself to suppress it. The one who still raises her hand, who still asks the question, who has not yet been worn down to the point of silence. And Maggie is the future. Whatever version of the future Springfield's impossible timeline eventually allows. These are not just characters in a cartoon. They are a family assembled to demonstrate something specific about the American experience. And the show has been demonstrating it patiently and consistently and with enormous craft for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. The theories make the demonstration legible. They give you a framework for understanding what you've been watching. Why the fish has 3 eyes. Why nobody ages. Why the man who owns the plant is still alive. Why the man who runs the plant's safety division is the man best positioned to ensure that the safety violations continue. It's not lazy writing. It was never lazy writing. It is a 36-year portrait of a community consuming itself, drawn with such affection and such humor and such commitment to the characters at its center that most viewers never quite register what the portrait is of. You were meant to love the family. That was the point of the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the peculiar skull shapes and the impractical hairstyles. To make them theirs. To make them immediately recognizable. To give you something to hold on to while the show did everything else it was doing in the margins, in the background, in the water, in the sky. The love is real. The affection is genuine. The show cares about Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie in the way that the best storytelling always cares about its characters. With the specific tenderness of someone who has spent a long time living with these people and finding, despite everything, that they are worth knowing. And underneath that love, underneath the tenderness and the comedy and the 36 years of couch gags and catchphrases, the show has been building a case. Patient, detailed, episode by episode, brick by brick. A case about a town that was poisoned. A case about a family that was broken. A case about a community that learned to choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths and made that choice so often that the choosing became invisible. The case is complete. It has been complete for years. All the evidence is in the record. All the witnesses have testified. The courtroom is full. Springfield just won't hear the verdict because Springfield doesn't do verdicts. Springfield does resets, and the next episode is always coming, and the cooling towers will still be there when it does, and Homer will still be in his chair, and the family will still be on the couch, and everything will be exactly as it was, which is, in the end, exactly what we wanted. We built the loop together. The show and the audience, week by week, year by year, choice by choice. And we'll keep building it, because home is what we make it. And we made this one on a yellow street in an impossible town, and it's ours, and we're not quite ready to leave. Not yet, maybe not ever. One last thing before we let Springfield go dark for the night. There's a quality that the best long-running stories develop over time that shorter stories can't quite replicate. Something that accumulates in the audience's relationship with the material across years of return visits and rewatched episodes and conversations with other fans about the moments that stayed with them. A depth of familiarity that is different from any other kind of familiarity. The familiarity of a place you've been going back to for so long that it's become part of your internal landscape. Most people who love The Simpsons don't just watch it, they carry it. They carry specific scenes, specific lines, specific moments that landed at the right time in their lives and lodged somewhere they couldn't quite reach to remove them. Homer's conversation with God, Marge's letter to Bart about why she believes in him, the final moments of Mother Simpson, where Homer sits on the roof of the car watching his mother's taillights disappear down the street. The moment at the end of Lisa's wedding where Lisa and Homer dance together and Homer tells her she'll meet someone who will love her for exactly who she is. These moments are not simply episodes of television. They are touchstones. They mark specific phases of the lives of the people who encountered them at the right moment. They became part of how those people understand love and family and loss, and the particular kind of patience required to keep going when the going is difficult. The theories we've explored tonight are one way of engaging with the show. A way that takes its internal logic seriously, that treats its accumulated details as evidence of something more coherent than a collection of jokes, that finds in its 36-year run a sustained meditation on power and biology and memory and what we do, as communities and as families, when the truth becomes too costly to sustain. But there's another way to engage with it that doesn't require the theories, doesn't require the contamination or the dream or the conspiracy or the denial. That just watches Homer find his way home at the end of every episode, and Marge waiting when he gets there, and the kids in the next room, and the house on Evergreen Terrace holding everything it was built to hold. That version of the show is also true. Simultaneously, alongside the theories running in the same episodes, visible in the same frames. The beauty of The Simpsons, the reason it has sustained the loyalty of its audience for longer than any other show in television history, is that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously and never fully commits to any one of them. It is a comedy and a critique and a portrait and a mystery and a dream and a warning and a love letter and a diagnosis, all in the same 42 minutes. All using the same yellow characters in the same impossible town. You can watch it for the jokes. You can watch it for the theories. You can watch it for the moments that remind you of something real and specific about the experience of being part of a family that loves you imperfectly and doesn't know how to say so. You can watch it because you grew up with it, and it's one of the things that stayed the same while everything else changed. All of those are valid relationships with the material. All of them are responses to something real that the show offers. And whatever brought you here tonight, whether it was curiosity about the theories, or the desire for something to listen to while you fall asleep, or the simple comfort of spending time in a place that has always been there when you needed it, we hope Springfield served its purpose. Springfield has always been good at that, serving purposes it didn't explicitly design itself for, being exactly what you needed it to be, in the moment you needed it, in the way that only a place you've been going back to for a very long time can manage. The cooling towers are quiet tonight. The river is still. The quick E-Mart sign is the only light on the main street. Apu is reading behind the counter in the empty store, waiting for the morning rush that will not come for several more hours. Ned Flanders' house is dark and tidy. Homer's house has one light on upstairs, the bedroom window, the warm yellow light that means someone is still awake or forgot to turn it off before sleeping. Maggie is in her crib. She is, as she always is, awake behind her closed eyes, watching, listening, storing everything. The town breathes in and breathes out. The invisible contamination moves through the air and the water and the ground in its slow, patient way. The dream continues, or the reality continues, or the denial continues, and the distinction between those three things grows smaller and smaller in the hour before dawn. Springfield is here. It will be here tomorrow. It will be here after that, and after that, in every episode that airs, and every rerun that finds its audience, and every late night when someone needs a familiar place to return to. The loop keeps running. The family keeps finding their way to the couch. Homer keeps coming home. And somewhere on Evergreen Terrace, in the yellow house with the green lawn and the car that's always slightly dented, and the nuclear plant visible in the distance on the horizon, there is a light that has been on for 36 years. Just in case you needed to find your way back. It's always on. Rest now. Springfield will be exactly where you left it when you wake up. It always is. Good night. There is something worth saying about the specific hour that Springfield exists in when we watch it, not the hour in the story. The hour outside the story. The hour when you're watching. When most people watch The Simpsons, at least the people who use it the way we're using it tonight, as something to let wash over them while the day releases its grip, the hour is late. The screens are dimmed, the house is quiet, the obligations of the day have finished or been set aside. There's a permission that comes with that hour, a permission to just receive rather than engage, to let the narrative flow through rather than processing it aggressively. The theories we've discussed tonight are the opposite of that posture. They require active engagement, sustained attention, the willingness to track connections across episodes and decades, and to build a case from details that the show distributes quietly across a very long run. But the theories don't require that posture in the moment of watching. They can be known in the background, like an understanding you carry into a familiar place that deepens your appreciation of it without disrupting your enjoyment. Knowing the radiation theory doesn't make the jokes less funny. Knowing the coma theory doesn't make Homer's love for his family less moving. Knowing the architecture of Springfield's denial doesn't make the show darker in any way that diminishes the warmth it also contains. It adds layers. It gives the experience more to hold. That's what good long-form storytelling does. It reveals itself gradually, over time, in different ways to different levels of attention. The casual viewer gets the jokes. The attentive viewer gets the patterns. The obsessive viewer gets the theories. And each level of engagement is served by the same material, the same episodes, the same accumulation of detail that the show has been building for 36 years. Springfield rewards attention. It always has. But it also rewards the absence of attention. The half-watched episode, the familiar episode playing in the background while you do something else. The episode that plays while you drift towards sleep, and you catch phrases and images that settle somewhere below active consciousness and become part of the ambient texture of a place you've been going back to for a long time. Both modes are valid. Both are offered by the same show. The theories live in the first mode, the comfort lives in the second. Tonight has moved between them. We spent time in the attentive mode, tracing the evidence, following the threads, examining what the show has been quietly saying beneath the jokes. And now we're settling into the other mode, the drift mode. The mode where Springfield doesn't require anything from you except the willingness to be in it. The cooling towers stand against whatever sky Springfield is offering tonight. The quick E-Mart is open and will always be open. Moe's is busy with the specific sadness of a bar, where everyone knows everyone and the knowledge is part of what keeps them coming back. The Springfield Elementary playground is empty, and the swing sets move slightly in a wind that has no particular source. Homer is home. The family is on the couch. The television in the Simpson living room is on. And whatever is playing on that television, whatever show the Simpsons are watching on their couch, in their house, in the town that exists everywhere and nowhere, it's something comfortable, something familiar, something they've seen before and will see again, something that feels like home. That's Springfield. That's what it offers. Let it offer it to you now. Let the theories recede into the background where they live, and let the town come forward in its simpler form. The yellow faces and the four fingers, and the impossible hair, and the cold beer, and the family whole and together and unchanged. Just Springfield. Just the show. Just this.